This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. I'll never forget the day I encountered something in the Appalachian wilderness that I still can't explain. This happened last October when I decided to take a solo backpacking trip along a remote section of trail that runs along the Tennessee-North Carolina border. I've been hiking for over 15 years and always preferred the solitude of less traveled paths. This particular trail was perfect. Challenging terrain, beautiful views, and typically very few people around, especially in the fall when the tourist season winds down. The first couple days were exactly what I wanted: perfect weather, clear skies, and that crisp autumn air that makes hiking in the Appalachians so special. I passed maybe 3 other hikers on day 1, just a couple on day 2, and by nightfall of the second day, I was completely alone in the wilderness, or so I thought. I set up camp at a small clearing about quarter-mile off the main trail, had some freeze-dried pasta, and fell asleep listening to the normal sounds of the forest: wind in the trees, distant owls, the occasional rustling of small nocturnal animals. The third morning started like any other. I woke up around 6:30, made some coffee on my portable stove, and packed everything up. The weather had turned slightly cooler, but nothing concerning. Just that typical mountain chill before the sun fully rises. I remember checking my GPS to confirm I was on track to reach my planned campsite by evening, about 12 miles ahead. About 2 hours into my hike that morning, I noticed something odd. The forest had gone completely silent. If you spend time in the woods, you know there's always some background noise: birds, insects, the wind. But suddenly, nothing. It was like someone had pressed mute on the entire forest. I actually stopped walking because the silence was so unnerving. I remember thinking maybe a storm was coming, but the sky was clear, and there was no change in air pressure that would indicate approaching weather. That's when the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I've spent enough time in the wilderness to know that when everything goes quiet, it usually means there's a predator nearby. My first thought was bear or maybe a mountain lion, so I instinctively reached for the bear spray in my hip pocket. I continued walking, much more cautiously now, scanning the trees on either side of the trail. After about another quarter-mile, I rounded a bend, and that's when I saw it. Maybe 30 feet off the trail, partially obscured by some underbrush. At first glance, it looked like a dead tree stump, or maybe a fallen log propped up against something. My brain tried to make sense of what I was seeing, trying to fit it into something familiar. But then it moved, just slightly, a subtle shift of weight from one side to another. And that's when I realized I was looking at some kind of creature. It was standing upright, which immediately made me think bear, but the proportions were all wrong. It stood about 5 feet tall, much shorter than a fully grown black bear on its hind legs, and its posture was unsettlingly human-like. It wasn't the natural stance of a bear standing up to get a better look. This thing was standing with its weight balanced evenly, almost like a person would. What really disturbed me was its appearance. The creature's skin was visible in patches, raw-looking, red, and irritated. Where it did have fur, it was thin and scraggly, hanging in clumps rather than covering the body evenly. My first thought was severe mange. I've seen photos of bears with mange before, but never anything this extreme. The disease had ravaged whatever this animal was to the point that it was almost unrecognizable. The creature was just standing there, not moving much, not doing anything in particular. Its eyes were half closed, glazed over in a way that made me wonder if it was sick or dying. It wasn't looking directly at me, but it wasn't ignoring me either. More like it was aware of my presence but couldn't quite focus. For what felt like several minutes but was probably only seconds, neither of us moved. I was frozen in place, partly out of fear, partly out of shock. Then, with no sense of urgency whatsoever, the creature slowly turned and walked deeper into the forest. It moved upright the entire time, never dropping to all fours like a bear would normally do. Its gait was awkward and stiff, like it was uncomfortable walking that way, but didn't know how else to move. Once it disappeared from view, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I debated turning around right then, heading back to my car and forgetting this trip altogether. But I convinced myself it was just a bear with a severe case of mange. Disturbing to see, sure, but not dangerous if I kept my distance. I continued hiking, but everything felt different. The silence eventually gave way to normal forest sounds again, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I kept my bear spray in my hand rather than in its holster, and I found myself stopping more frequently to look over my shoulder. Around midday, I reached a stream crossing that required me to walk through about 6 inches of water. As I made my way across, I noticed something in the soft mud of the bank that made me stop cold. Tracks, but not normal animal tracks. These were wider than human footprints with splayed toes, almost like a distorted handprint. They were oddly spaced and uneven, as if whatever made them couldn't properly control its steps. The prints led into the water and presumably continued on the other side, but the rocky bottom of the stream didn't hold any impressions. I stood there for a long time, staring at those tracks, trying to convince myself they belonged to something ordinary, a raccoon, an opossum, anything normal. But the size and shape were all wrong, and the way they were spaced, it was like watching the faltering steps of something that was trying to walk like a human, but couldn't quite remember how. By this point, I was seriously considering cutting my trip short. But the shortest route back to my car was actually to continue forward rather than backtrack, so I pressed on, promising myself I'd hike until dusk and then make camp in the most secure location I could find. I found a small clearing that evening that seemed relatively protected, rocky outcropping on one side, dense brush on another, and good visibility in the other directions. I set up my tent, cooked a quick dinner, and got inside well before dark. I double-checked that my bear spray was within reach, and even took my hiking poles into the tent with me, something I'd never done before. Despite my exhaustion, sleep didn't come easily. Every sound outside made me tense up. Eventually, I must have drifted off because I suddenly jerked awake to complete darkness. My watch showed it was just after 2 in the morning. At first, I couldn't figure out what had woken me, but then I heard it. Heavy, labored breathing coming from maybe 20 feet behind my tent. It wasn't the sound of a normal animal. The breathing was raspy and uneven, punctuated by what I can only describe as wheezing groans. It was the breathing of something sick or injured, something suffering. I lay perfectly still, barely daring to breathe myself. The sound didn't move closer, but it didn't go away either. For what felt like hours, I listened to that labored breathing, clutching my bear spray with white knuckles, terrified that at any moment the creature might approach my tent. I don't know exactly when the sound stopped. At some point, I realized I couldn't hear it anymore, but I was too afraid to move or make any noise that might attract attention. I lay there until the first hints of dawn showed through the tent fabric, then waited another hour until it was fully light outside. when I finally worked up the courage to unzip my tent. The clearing was empty. There were no tracks, no signs that anything had been there. Part of me wondered if I'd dreamed the whole thing, but I know what I heard. That breathing is something I'll never forget. I packed up my gear in record time that morning. I didn't bother with breakfast or coffee. I just wanted to get out of there. I hiked the remaining 8 miles to my car in just under 4 hours, moving faster than I ever had with a full pack. In the weeks following my trip, I did a lot of research. I looked into reports of strange creatures in the Appalachians, read about black bears with advanced mange, even delved into local folklore about mountain monsters. The rational part of my brain still tells me it was probably just a diseased bear. Mange can cause hair loss, skin irritation, and unusual behavior in animals. But what I saw didn't move like a bear. It didn't stand like a bear. And those eyes, they held something I still can't explain. Not intelligence exactly, but a vacancy that seemed deeper than animal awareness, like something that had forgotten what it was. I've gone back to hiking since then, but I stick to more popular trails now. Sometimes when I'm in the woods and things get quiet, I find myself scanning the trees, half expecting to see that figure again, that creature that seemed to have forgotten how to be whatever it once was. The strangest part? As disturbing as the encounter was, I felt something beyond fear when I saw that creature. I felt pity. Whatever it was suffering, not just physically from what appeared to be disease, but somehow deeper, like it was lost in every possible way. I still hike the Appalachians, but never alone in the remote sections anymore. Some things you see change how you view the wilderness. I used to find comfort in the solitude of the backcountry. Now I find myself wondering what else might be out there, forgotten by the world, perhaps even forgotten by itself. Waha, Story 2. I still remember the exact feel of that hand, even though it's been 5 months since it happened. I haven't told many people about this. Who would believe me? But I need to write it down somewhere, if only to convince myself I'm not going mad. It was early January of this year, 1872, when I traveled from Edinburgh to Dublin to visit my mother's cousin and his family. I hadn't seen them in years, but a letter arrived just after Christmas explaining that old Uncle William had suffered a severe stroke and was bedridden. His wife, my Aunt Margaret, though she's not really my aunt, wondered if I might come stay for a time, as William had always been fond of me. The journey was miserable, bitterly cold with snow and sleet the entire way. I arrived at their townhouse on Marion Square, feeling half frozen and exhausted. The house was one of those grand old Georgian places, 3 stories tall with high ceilings and drafty hallways. I'd visited twice before as a child, but had forgotten how imposing it was. Aunt Margaret greeted me with obvious relief. She looked 10 years older than when I'd last seen her, with dark circles under her eyes and a perpetual worry line between her brows. "Thank God you've come, James," she said, clasping my hands. "William asks for you daily." Uncle William was installed in a bedroom on the 1st floor, having been moved from the master bedroom upstairs, so the servants wouldn't have to carry him up and down. His condition was worse than I'd imagined. He lay pale and shrunken in the massive 4-poster bed, the right side of his face drooping oddly. He could speak only a few slurred words and couldn't move his right arm or leg at all. A local doctor visited daily, though he admitted there was little to be done except keep William comfortable and hope for improvement. The household staff had been taking turns sitting with him through the night, but they were clearly exhausted. I immediately offered to take a shift, and it was decided I would alternate nights with Thomas, the footman who'd been with the family for nearly 20 years. The first 16 nights passed uneventfully. I would sit in an armchair beside Uncle William's bed, reading by lamplight or sometimes dozing. He slept fitfully, occasionally waking with a start and reaching for me with his good hand. I'd give him water or adjust his pillows, and he'd drift back to sleep. On the 17th night, January 23rd, I'll never forget the date, Uncle William seemed more peaceful than usual. He fell asleep early, and his breathing was deep and regular. By midnight, I was struggling to keep my eyes open. Thomas appeared at the door for his usual check-in, and I mentioned how well the patient was doing. "Why don't you get some proper sleep tonight, sir?" Thomas suggested. "I'll look in on him regularly and call you if there's any change." I was grateful for the offer. My bedroom was directly above William's, so I'd hear if there was any commotion. I retired around 12:30, changed into my nightshirt, and fell into bed. I'm not sure how long I slept before I felt it, a gentle pressure on my left shoulder, as if someone was trying to wake me. I assumed it was Thomas coming to tell me William needed something. "What is it?" I mumbled, still half asleep. No answer came, but the pressure remained. "Thomas?" I asked, a bit louder. The pressure increased slightly, becoming more insistent. I was irritated now, thinking the footman was being unnecessarily mysterious. "What's wrong? Is it Uncle William?" I demanded, finally sitting up and reaching toward where I thought Thomas must be standing. My hand closed around something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. It was a hand, warm, soft, and undeniably human. But I couldn't see anyone there. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. My mind refused to process what was happening. I was holding a hand that was attached to nothing visible. Finally, I managed to croak out, "Who's there? Show yourself." No answer came. The hand remained completely still in my grip, neither pulling away nor tightening. I'm not a coward, and my first thought was that this must be some kind of trick. Perhaps one of the servants was playing a prank, though it seemed unlikely given the somber atmosphere in the house. "I know someone's there," I said, my voice steadier now. "Identify yourself immediately." Nothing. I tightened my grip on the hand and pulled, thinking I would force whoever it was into view. To my shock, the unseen presence was stronger than me. The hand didn't budge an inch. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. With my free hand, I reached out tentatively in the darkness. My fingers connected with what felt like a sleeve, thick woolen material like a winter coat. I traced upward to what seemed to be a crisp linen cuff, and then nothing. The arm simply ended at about the elbow. I remember letting out a sound, not quite a scream, more a strangled gasp. My grip loosened for just a fraction of a second, and in that moment, the hand slipped away from mine. At that exact instant, the grandfather clock in the hallway below began to strike 2. I sat frozen in my bed, my heart hammering so loudly I could barely hear the chimes. When the last note faded, I lunged for the matchbox on my bedside table and lit the lamp with shaking hands. The room was empty. I checked under the bed, behind the curtains, in the wardrobe. Nothing. The door was still locked from the inside, just as I'd left it. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat upright in bed, lamp burning brightly, until the first gray light of dawn appeared at the windows. Only then did I venture downstairs to check on Uncle William. He was sleeping peacefully, and Thomas reported no disturbances during the night. At breakfast, I must have looked awful because Aunt Margaret commented on it immediately. "Are you ill, James? You're white as a sheet." I hesitated, not wanting to upset her further with tales of ghosts. But before I could decide what to say, Martha, the elderly housekeeper who'd been serving us, spoke up. "You've had a visit from Aunt Betty, haven't you, sir?" she asked matter-of-factly, pouring tea. What?" I stammered. Martha nodded knowingly. "That room, it was hers, you know. Died there in 1820, she did. Master William's great-aunt Elizabeth. Fearsome woman by all accounts." Aunt Margaret sighed heavily. "Really, Martha, must you start with these stories again? James doesn't want to hear such nonsense." But I did want to hear. "What happened in that room?" I asked. Despite Aunt Margaret's protests, Martha told me about Aunt Betty, apparently a formidable woman who had ruled the household with an iron fist until her death in the upper rooms over 50 years earlier. According to Martha, the room I was staying in had a reputation. Guests had reported bedclothes being yanked away in the night, invisible hands slapping them awake, and dark shapes moving in the shadows. "Lady Carmichael stayed there 3 years ago," Martha said, lowering her voice. "Said she felt something leap off her bed in the middle of the night, heavy as a person it was, and then nothing there when she lit her lamp. And there was that general," added Cook, who had wandered in from the kitchen, clearly eager to join the conversation. "Remember him, Martha. Stayed 2 nights and left without even saying goodbye. White-faced and shaking he was. Never would say what happened, but he wrote later saying he wouldn't set foot in this house again, not for all the tea and china." Aunt Margaret was furious with the servants for filling James's head with superstition, but I pressed them for more details. None of their stories, however, matched my experience exactly. No one had mentioned holding an invisible hand before. I didn't tell them precisely what had happened to me. Something held me back. Perhaps the fear that speaking about it would somehow make it more real. Or maybe a strange sense that what had happened was private, meant only for me. That night, I was due to sit with Uncle William again. I was exhausted but determined not to show weakness. As I settled into the chair beside his bed, I found myself glancing frequently at the ceiling, thinking about what or who might be directly above us. Uncle William slept peacefully that night and the next. When my turn came to sleep in that room again, I almost asked to be moved elsewhere but couldn't bring myself to admit my fear. Nothing happened that night, nor the next. Weeks passed, and I continued to sleep in Aunt Betty's former room without any further supernatural encounters. But I've never forgotten the feel of that hand in mine. It wasn't cold or clammy as I might have expected a ghost's hand to be. It was warm and soft, a live feeling, which made the experience all the more unsettling. I've replayed that moment countless times in my mind, wondering what would have happened if I hadn't let go. Would I have seen something? Would it have spoken to me? Was it trying to warn me about something? Or was it asking for help? Uncle William survived his stroke and is slowly improving, so it wasn't heralding his death as I first feared. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, a vivid dream brought on by stress and exhaustion. But then I remember the distinct sensation of wool and linen beneath my fingers, the unyielding strength of that invisible arm, and I know it was real. I'm still in Dublin. Aunt Margaret has asked me to stay through the summer, and I've agreed. I continue to sleep in that same room, though I often wake in the night thinking I feel a slight pressure on my shoulder. But when I reach out, there's never anything there. I regret letting go of that hand. I should have held on, demanded answers, followed wherever it might have led me. But in that moment of shock and fear, I hesitated, and now I'll never know what Aunt Betty wanted to tell me. Story 3. I've been hesitant to share this for months now, but I need to get it off my chest. Maybe someone here has experienced something similar or can make sense of what happened. I still can't. Back in April, I was going through a rough patch. Work was overwhelming. My relationship had just ended, and I desperately needed some time alone to clear my head. I found this cabin rental online. Nothing fancy, pretty basic actually, but it was cheap and secluded. The listing mentioned it was a bit rustic and hadn't been used much recently, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away from everything and everyone. It was about a 3-hour drive from the city, deep in the woods. I remember feeling relieved as the buildings thinned out and the forest got thicker. The directions were pretty vague, just a series of unmarked dirt roads that Google Maps couldn't really track. I almost turned around twice, thinking I was lost. When I finally found it, the cabin looked neglected. Not at all like the photos. The wood was graying and the small porch sagged on one side. Dead leaves had piled up against the door like no one had been there in months. I told myself it was fine. I wasn't here for luxury, just solitude. The key was under a rock by the steps, exactly where the owner said it would be. I remember the door sticking as I pushed it open and this cloud of dust billowing out. The musty smell hit me immediately, that damp, stale air that hangs in places long abandoned. Something felt off from the first moment I stepped inside. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on, just this heaviness in the air, like the cabin was holding its breath. It was a simple layout. One main room with a kitchenette, a small bedroom off to the side, and a tiny bathroom. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust. I ran my finger across the dining table and left a clean streak behind. The place was supposed to be prepared for my arrival. Clearly, it wasn't. Still, I told myself it was fine. I unloaded my car, opened some windows to air the place out, and tried to settle in. But I couldn't relax. Instead of unpacking properly or sitting down with a book like I'd planned, I found myself pacing. I kept walking around the cabin, looking in corners, opening and closing cupboards. I don't know what I was searching for. The fridge hummed loudly, one of those old models that sounds like it's working too hard. Inside, there wasn't much. A half-empty bottle of ketchup, some butter, and a carton of eggs that I checked and found were still good, surprisingly. The pantry was similarly bare. A few canned beans, some instant coffee, salt and pepper, and oddly, a full-sized bag of chips that looked new compared to everything else. I'd brought some of my own food, so I wasn't concerned, but that bag of chips bothered me. It seemed so out of place among the dusty, forgotten items. As the afternoon wore on, I realized how utterly silent it was outside. I've been in the woods before. They're never actually quiet. There's always something, birds calling, insects buzzing, leaves rustling. But around this cabin, nothing. The silence pressed against the windows like a physical thing. I made myself dinner, just pasta with some sauce I'd brought. Simple. As I was eating, I noticed the sun setting and the woods outside growing darker. The shadows seemed to move differently than they should. I told myself it was just my imagination, my city brain not used to the deep darkness of rural nights. After dinner, I was searching through the cupboards for tea when I found a bag of beef jerky tucked in the back. It wasn't dusty like everything else. The packaging looked normal enough, one of those resealable bags you get at gas stations. I figured the owner must have left it recently, or maybe the last guest did. I took it to the couch and turned on the small TV, only static. The DVD player worked though, and there were some old movies stacked nearby. I put one on, some forgettable action film, and opened the jerky. The first few pieces tasted fine. a little spicier than I like, but normal. I was about halfway through the bag when I heard it, a sharp cracking sound from outside, like a branch breaking under weight, then another and another, getting closer. I muted the TV and listened. The sounds were deliberate, methodical, not like an animal moving randomly through undergrowth. Whatever was out there was coming straight toward the cabin. I grabbed the flashlight I'd left on the table and went to the window. The beam seemed weak against the absolute darkness. I swept it across the tree line but saw nothing unusual. Just trees and shadows, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. When the cracking sound stopped, I felt even more uneasy. I returned to the couch but couldn't focus on the movie anymore. I reached for the jerky again, more out of nervous habit than hunger. That's when I noticed it felt wrong. The texture had changed. It was wetter somehow, and the pieces seemed to give way differently between my teeth. And the bag, it felt heavier than it should have, like there was more in it now than when I started. I picked up the flashlight and pointed it into the bag. What I saw makes me sick to remember. The remaining jerky pieces were moving slightly, not like they were alive, but like something inside them was. I dumped the contents onto the coffee table, and that's when I saw them. Tiny, segmented legs embedded in the meat, and this dark, oily substance that wasn't sauce or marinade. It was oozing from the pieces, pooling on the table. I jumped up, knocking the table over. Some of that stuff got on my hands, and it burned slightly, like mild acid. I ran to the sink and scrubbed my hands raw under hot water. When I turned around, something caught my eye. A movement in the corner of the room behind an old armchair. Something was crouched there, something large. At first, my mind tried to rationalize it. A raccoon, maybe, or some other animal that had found its way inside. But this was too big, too still. No animal stays that perfectly motionless. And the shape was all wrong, hunched but tall, filling the space between the chair and the ceiling. I stood frozen at the sink, the water still running behind me. I couldn't see details in the darkness, just this hulking silhouette, but I could feel it watching me, studying me, and somehow I knew with absolute certainty that whatever was in that corner wasn't human and wasn't an animal. It was something else entirely. I don't remember deciding to move. My body just acted. I grabbed my car keys from the counter and ran. I didn't take my bags, my phone, nothing else. Just the keys clutched so tight in my hand, they left marks in my palm. The door stuck again as I pushed against it, like something was holding it from the other side. When it finally gave way, I nearly fell down the porch steps. I could hear movement inside the cabin now. A sliding, dragging sound, like something heavy pulling itself across the floor. I made it to my car, fumbling with the keys. The engine started on the first try, thank God. I reversed so fast I hit a tree, cracking my taillight. I didn't care. As I sped down the dirt road, my headlights caught something at the edge of the trees, just for a second. A tall, thin shape, bent at unnatural angles. It was only a glimpse, but I'm certain it wasn't human, and it wasn't alone. There were others, deeper in the trees, just beyond where my lights could reach. I drove blindly, not sure if I was even on the right road. Eventually, I hit the main highway and just kept going until I saw lights from a gas station. I pulled in, hands shaking so badly I could barely turn off the engine. The attendant must have thought I was crazy or on drugs. I probably looked, wild-eyed, still in my socks, no jacket despite the cold night. He let me use his phone to call a friend to come get me. I couldn't bring myself to go back, not even for my things. I reported what happened to the local sheriff the next day. They sent someone to check the cabin, but all they found were my bags, neatly packed by the door. The jerky bag was gone. So was the strange substance on the table. They said there was no sign of any disturbance or intruder. The cabin owner claimed they'd cleaned the place before my arrival and fully stocked the kitchen. They had no record of any jerky being left there. They suggested I might have been spooked by normal forest sounds and offered me a discount on a future stay. As if I'd ever go back. I still have nightmares about what was in that jerky, about the silence in those woods, about what was watching me from behind that chair. I wake up tasting something metallic and foreign in my mouth. I've tried researching the area, the cabin's history. Nothing unusual comes up, but I know what I experienced. Something was in there with me. Something had prepared that food, left it for me to find, to consume. And I still don't know why. I haven't eaten meat since that night. I can't. Every time I try, I remember the texture changing in my mouth, the tiny legs, the watching presence. Whatever was in that cabin, whatever left that food for me to find, it wasn't human, and I don't think it wanted me to leave. Story 4. I never really believed in ghosts or anything supernatural before all this happened, and to be honest, I'm still trying to process everything. My family and I moved into this brick house in Bellevue about 7 months ago. It's a beautiful place with this cool turret and slate roof that made my wife fall in love with it immediately. We got it for a decent price too, which should have been my first clue something was off, but I just thought we got lucky in this crazy housing market. The first month was completely normal. We were busy unpacking, getting the kids settled in their new schools, and I was figuring out my new commute. Nothing weird happened at all. I remember joking with my wife about how disappointed our daughter Emily was because she'd convinced herself old houses were always haunted, and ours seemed boringly normal. Then things started happening that I couldn't explain away. The first incident was with the kitchen light. I'm usually the last one to bed, and I'm obsessive about turning off lights to save on the electric bill. One night, I checked everything, turned off the kitchen light, and headed upstairs. I was almost asleep when I noticed a glow coming from downstairs. I figured maybe my son Mark had come down for a midnight snack, but when I went to check, nobody was there. Just the kitchen light, fully on. I thought maybe I'd forgotten to turn it off, even though I clearly remembered doing it. But the weird part was the switch itself. We have those older toggle switches, and it was definitely flipped up to the on position. I know I'd flipped it down before heading to bed. This started happening at least once a week. I'd turn off the light, and later it would be back on, switch flipped up, as if someone had physically pushed it. Around the same time, my wife started complaining about hearing footsteps on the stairs at night. Our bedroom is on the second floor, and she'd wake me up sometimes, whispering, "Do you hear that? Someone's on the stairs." I'd listen, and sure enough, there would be distinct footstep sounds coming up the stairs. Not creaking or settling noises, but deliberate steps, like someone walking slowly up. Every time I'd check, there was nobody there, and the kids were sound asleep in their rooms. My daughter Emily had the most frequent experiences. She's 14 and kept telling us someone was tapping her on the shoulder when she was alone in her room. At first, we thought she was making it up for attention because of the move, but she's never been the type to invent stories. One night, she came running into our room, genuinely terrified, saying someone had tapped her 3 times on her right shoulder while she was studying at her desk. She'd spun around expecting to see one of us, but her room was empty. After that, she started keeping her door open all the time. I didn't experience anything truly unsettling myself until about 3 months after we moved in. I was having a rough time at work. My company was going through layoffs, and I was stressed about possibly losing my job. One night around 11, everyone else had gone to bed, and I was sitting in the living room with just a small lamp on, trying to calm my thoughts. That's when I saw him. My dad, who passed away 5 years ago, was suddenly sitting in the armchair across from me. He wasn't transparent or ghostly. He looked completely solid, wearing the flannel shirt he always used to wear on weekends. He looked exactly like he did before he got sick. I couldn't move or speak. I just stared at him, and he stared back with this gentle expression. Then he said, "It's going to be all right, son. You've always found a way through tough times." It was his voice, perfectly clear, not muffled or distant or echoing like you'd expect a ghost's voice to be. Then he smiled at me, and between one blink and the next, he was gone. I sat there for at least an hour afterward, trying to convince myself it was just stress or that I'd fallen asleep without realizing it. But I know I was awake, and I know what I saw. The strangest part is that I wasn't scared, just shocked and then weirdly comforted. 2 days later, I found out my position at work was safe. Coincidence maybe, but it felt like more than that. But all of these experiences were nothing compared to what happened in the cottage. Behind our main house is a converted garage that the previous owners fixed up into a small guest house. It's cute. One main room with a kitchenette, a bathroom, and a loft bedroom accessible by a ladder. We call it the cottage and use it as a studio space. I have my piano in there, my wife has her sewing stuff, and sometimes the kids use it to hang out with friends. From the beginning, there was something off about that place. The air feels different in there, heavier somehow, like the atmospheric pressure is wrong. My son Mark, who's 17 and into all that skeptical science stuff, hated going in there from day one. He said he constantly felt like he was being watched. When he had to stay in there one weekend while his bedroom was being painted, he said he saw strange shadows through the bathroom window, like someone moving around inside when he knew the bathroom was empty. My personal experience in the cottage is something I still have trouble talking about. It happened just 2 weeks ago, and just writing this now is making my hands shake a little. It was a Thursday night, and I'd gone out to the cottage to play piano for a while. Everyone else was busy. My wife was on a video call with her sister, Emily was at a friend's house, and Mark was upstairs gaming with headphones on. It was around 8 in the evening, dark outside, but not late. I'd been playing for maybe 20 minutes when the temperature in the room suddenly dropped. I mean, it got cold enough that I could see my breath. My first thought was that the heating had failed, but it happened so suddenly that it didn't make sense. Then the lights dimmed slightly, not like a power fluctuation, but like something was drawing energy from them. I stopped playing, and in that silence, I heard a woman's voice, clear as day, coming from somewhere behind me. She asked, "Should we show him, or should we tell him?" I spun around on the piano bench. There was no woman there, but hovering over the small sofa against the wall was a whitish-gray cloud, about the size of a person, just floating there. It wasn't shaped like a human exactly, more like a dense fog, but somehow I knew it was looking at me. I felt its attention, its focus. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I thought about running, but something made me stay. Maybe curiosity, maybe shock, I don't know. Instead, I said out loud, "If you're real, prove it. Do something physical." I don't know what possessed me to challenge it like that. The words just came out. Then I added, "Beat on the floor. Let me hear you." For about 10 seconds, nothing happened. Then came two of the loudest, most powerful knocks I've ever felt. They didn't just make noise, they vibrated through the entire cottage, through the floor, and up through my feet and legs. The force almost knocked me off the bench. And here's the thing. The cottage is built on a concrete slab. There's no crawl space underneath, nowhere for anyone to be hiding to make those sounds. I was frozen in place, staring at the cloud, which seemed to be pulsating now. Then, right in the middle of it, something began to form. It was a ball of something, growing larger until it was between the size of a basketball and a beach ball. The outside of it was black and looked burned, with holes in it like it had been partly consumed by fire. Through those holes I could see what looked like glowing embers, not flame exactly, but a deep, pulsing reddish light, like the heart of a fire. The ball began to move, floating slowly away from the sofa and toward the ladder that leads up to the loft. As it moved, the cloud moved with it, surrounding it like an aura. That's when my courage gave out. Every instinct screamed at me to get out of there. I stumbled to my feet, back toward the door without taking my eyes off that thing, fumbled behind me for the doorknob, and then ran. I ran all the way back to the main house, slammed the door behind me, and stood in my kitchen breathing like I'd run a marathon. My wife found me there, asked what was wrong. I couldn't explain it to her then. I just said, I thought I saw something move outside and it startled me. I didn't go back to the cottage that night. The next morning, in daylight, I forced myself to go back out there. Everything looked normal. No cloud, no glowing ball, no cold spots. I checked every inch of that place and found nothing unusual, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I've been back to the cottage a few times since then, but never alone and never at night. Part of me regrets running away. That voice had asked if they should show or tell me something, and I'll never know what message they had. My rational mind keeps trying to explain it all away. Stress, an overactive imagination, maybe even a mini-stroke or something that caused hallucinations. But those knocks, the force of them, the way they traveled up through my body, that wasn't in my head, and that glowing, ember-filled ball wasn't something I could have imagined. I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened that night. I don't know if it was my dad's spirit trying to communicate again, or something else entirely. All I know is that it was real, and it's changed how I see the world. Sometimes I catch myself looking toward the cottage from our kitchen window, wondering if they're still waiting in there, waiting for me to come back so they can finish what they started to show me. I've never shared this with anyone besides my immediate family. They believe me because they've had their own experiences in this house. But I know how it sounds to everyone else. I know because I used to be one of those people who thought ghost stories were just that, stories. Now I'm not so sure, and that uncertainty is almost as unsettling as what I experienced that night in the cottage. Story 5. I've been an ER nurse at Portland's Level 1 Trauma Center for 7 years now. I've seen things that would make most people faint, gunshot wounds, industrial accidents, you name it. But there was this one shift last winter that still haunts me. I can't shake it. Sometimes I wake up at night and I'm right back there, hands sticky with blood, the monitors beeping frantically around me. It started as just another Wednesday shift. I was already 12 hours in, running on coffee and pure adrenaline. The department was slammed, every bed full, patients lining the hallways on gurneys, the usual controlled chaos. I had just finished placing an IV in an elderly woman with pneumonia when my charge nurse grabbed my arm. "Michael, we need you in Trauma 1. Chopper landing in 3 minutes with a level 1. They're calling for hot offload." For those who don't know, hot offload means the patient is actively dying. No time for paperwork or pleasantries. The helicopter lands, we grab the patient, and we're working before the rotors even stop spinning. I rushed to the trauma bay where our team was already gowning up. 2 trauma surgeons, respiratory therapy, pharmacy, blood bank rep, and me as the primary nurse. The room had that tense quiet that always comes before these cases. Everyone mentally preparing for what was about to come through those doors. The double doors burst open, and in they came. Flight medics pushing the stretcher at full speed, one straddling the patient performing CPR. My first glimpse is something I'll never forget. She was young, maybe late 20s. Her face was ghostly white against hair so soaked with blood it looked black. Her skull was partially caved in on the right side. Gray matter and blood mixed together. One eye was swollen shut, the other half open, unfocused. She was wearing a light blue sweater, now dark crimson down the front. Sophia Reynolds, 28, single vehicle crash into a concrete barrier. Unrestrained driver, found unresponsive at scene. GCS of 3 on arrival. BP was unobtainable in the field. We've been doing CPR for 17 minutes. Pushed 3 of EPI, 1 of atropine. Attempted intubation, but couldn't visualize cords due to blood in airway. I started cutting off her clothes while our attending took over airway management. Someone else took over compressions. My hands moved automatically, placing the defibrillator pads, drawing up medications, setting up for central line placement. The room was loud but focused, everyone shouting vitals and orders, equipment beeping and hissing. "No pulse, continue CPR. I need suction, more suction. Push another epi now. Where's that ONEG? We need blood hanging." I've been in hundreds of traumas, but this one felt different from the start. Maybe it was how young she was. Maybe it was the severity of her injuries. Her hands were still soft, nails painted a chipped pale pink. She had a small tattoo on her wrist, a semicolon. My sister has one just like it, for suicide awareness. People who could have ended their story but chose to continue. 20 minutes in, we got a pulse. The monitor showed a rhythm, weak, but there. The team didn't cheer, but you could feel the collective exhale. Getting a pulse back after that long is rare. We were still intubating, still pushing blood and fluids, still trying to get some semblance of stability. That's when my charge nurse appeared at the door again, her face grim. "Michael, we have another incoming. Pediatric trauma, level 2, ETA 10 minutes. My stomach dropped. "Related to this one?" She nodded. 2-year-old male from the same MVA, son of the driver. The words hit me like a physical blow. The woman on our table, Sophia, had a child in the car, a 2-year-old boy who was now headed to our department. I couldn't leave Sophia. We were in the middle of placing arterial lines, hanging the 4th unit of blood, preparing for emergency neurosurgery if we could stabilize her enough. The trauma surgeon glanced up at me. "We got this. Go prep the pediatric bay." I rushed to get the other trauma room ready, pulling out the pediatric equipment, the smaller tubes and catheters, the Broslo tape for weight-based dosing. My mind was racing. How bad was the child injured? Had he watched his mother's head smash against the windshield? The thought made me sick. The ambulance arrived, and I steeled myself for another broken body. But when the paramedics walked in, one of them was carrying the little boy in his arms. He wasn't on a stretcher. He wasn't intubated. He was just sitting there. Marcus Reynolds, 2 years and 4 months. Found still strapped in his car seat in the back. Vitals stable. No apparent injuries except some minor lacerations on his left arm from broken glass. He hasn't said a word since we got him out. The paramedic gently set the boy down on our stretcher. He was tiny, with dark curly hair and enormous brown eyes that stared blankly ahead. He was wearing dinosaur pajama pants and a t-shirt with a cartoon character I didn't recognize. His left sleeve was soaked in blood. Not his, I realized with horror. His mother's. He had tiny blue Velcro sneakers on his feet. "Hey, buddy," I said softly, kneeling to his eye level. "My name's Michael. I'm going to take care of you, okay?" Nothing, not even a blink. Just those huge eyes staring through me. Our pediatric physician came in and began examining him, speaking in soft, gentle tones. Marcus didn't cry, didn't flinch, didn't react at all when she shined the light in his eyes or listened to his heart. It was like he'd shut down completely. The doctor looked at me. Physically, he seems okay. Minor cuts on the arm, maybe some bruising, but he's in shock. Let's get child life in here and call social services. I nodded, then my attention was pulled back to Trauma 1 when I heard the alarm, the long, continuous beep of a systole, flatline. "We need hands in here," someone shouted. I looked back at Marcus, now sitting with a child life specialist who had appeared with a stuffed bear, then rushed back to his mother's room. Sophia's rhythm had deteriorated. She was back in cardiac arrest. The team had resumed CPR, the surgeon's arms pumping against her chest, cracking what ribs weren't already broken. "How long has she been down again?" he asked, sweat dripping from his forehead. "About 2 minutes, the respiratory therapist answered. "Push another epi. Where's that bicarb?" I jumped back in, drawing medications, adjusting lines, watching the monitor. Nothing. Just that straight green line marching across the screen. 5 minutes passed, 10, 15. The surgeon finally stopped compressions, straightening his back with a grimace of pain. Time of death, 23:47. The room fell silent, except for the hiss of the ventilator, still pushing air into lungs that no longer needed it. The surgeon pulled off his gloves with a snap. "God damn it!" He turned away, shoulders slumped. "What do we know about the circumstances?" The charge nurse stepped forward. Police said there were no skid marks at the scene. She accelerated directly into the barrier. They found an empty prescription bottle of Ativan in the cup holder. My blood went cold, the semicolon tattoo, the deliberate crash, the carefully secured child in the back seat. "She did this on purpose," I whispered, "but she made sure her son was strapped in." No one responded. What could anyone say? I helped clean up Sophia's body, wiping away the blood, covering the worst of her injuries before her son could possibly see her. It was futile. She was unrecognizable now, but it felt important, this last dignity. When I returned to check on Marcus, he was exactly as I'd left him, sitting perfectly still, clutching the stuffed bear, those enormous eyes staring at nothing. Blood, his mother's blood, was drying on his little jacket, turning brown and stiff. The social worker was there, making calls to find any family members. They eventually located Sophia's mother in Eugene, who broke down, sobbing, when they told her. She didn't even know her daughter was struggling. I sat with Marcus for a while after my shift ended. I couldn't just leave. He still hadn't spoken, hadn't cried. I sang him songs, offered him juice, tried to get any reaction. Nothing. It was like looking at a shell of a child. Around 3 a.m, his grandmother arrived, tear-stained and trembling. When she saw Marcus, she made a sound I'll never forget, half sob, half wail. She rushed to him, gathering him in her arms, pressing her face into his curls. "Oh, baby," "Oh, my sweet baby," she kept repeating. And finally, Marcus blinked. His little face crumpled and he started to cry. Not the tantrum of a toddler, but the deep, soul-crushing sobs of grief that no 2-year-old should ever experience. I walked out to my car at 4 in the morning, sat behind the wheel, and completely broke down. 7 years in emergency medicine, and nothing had ever hit me like this. Not because of the gore or the tragedy, we see that daily, but because of those little blue shoes, the careful way she'd strapped him in before trying to end her own life, the semicolon tattoo that said she'd fought these demons before. I still think about Marcus. I wonder if he'll remember any of it, or if his mind will mercifully erase that night. I wonder if he'll ever understand what happened to his mom, or why. I've seen a lot of death in my career, but I've never seen anything as haunting as a toddler sitting perfectly still, wearing tiny blue sneakers, his mother's blood drying on his sleeve, waiting for someone to tell him everything would be okay when I knew it never would be again. Story 6. We were living in my family's old house at the time, a respectable place with 3 floors and too many rooms for just the 2 of us. But that's what was expected when you came from my background. Catherine's family had insisted we live somewhere suitable for raising children, and the house had been in my family for 2 generations. Edward was only 5 weeks old, and Catherine was exhausted from the constant feeding and changing. I'd been helping as much as I could, but there's only so much a father can do with a newborn. I suggested she take the master bedroom with the baby, and I'd sleep in the drawing room downstairs, so at least one of us could get proper rest. It was a sensible arrangement. The drawing room had a comfortable chaise lounge that converted to a bed, and I could still hear if she called for me. That night, I remember being completely drained. Running my father's business while trying to support a new mother and child had left me with little energy. I must have fallen asleep almost instantly after settling onto the makeshift bed. The drawing room was comfortable enough. Bookshelves lining one wall, my father's old desk in the corner, and large windows that looked out onto the garden. In winter, with snow covering everything, it was actually quite peaceful. I don't know exactly what time it was when I first heard it. The fire had died down to embers, casting just enough light to make out the shapes of furniture. Something pulled me from the depths of sleep. A whisper right beside my ear. Willie. That's what they called me. William officially, but Willie to family. I opened my eyes, thinking Catherine had come down with the baby and needed help. But when I turned my head, there was no one beside me. "Catherine," I said, sitting up and rubbing my eyes. That's when I saw her. Not Catherine, but someone else. A woman stood at the foot of my bed, gray shawl draped over her shoulders and head, partially obscuring her face. She was absolutely still, just watching me. I could make out enough of her features to see she wasn't anyone I recognized. "Hello? Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice embarrassingly high with surprise. "How did you get in here?" She didn't answer. She didn't even move. She just stood there, her face half hidden, staring at me with eyes I couldn't quite see in the dim light. I reached for the lamp on the side table, but before I could light it, she started moving. Not walking exactly. It was more like she drifted backward toward the window. I blinked, and she was gone, just vanished into the shadows by the curtains. My heart was racing. I jumped up immediately and checked the door to the drawing room, locked, just as I'd left it. There was a boudoir attached to the room, but when I threw open that door, it was empty too. The windows were all secured against the February cold. I was shaken, but tried to rationalize it. Perhaps I'd been dreaming, or the stress of new fatherhood was causing me to hallucinate. After checking that all entrances to the room were secure, I decided to go upstairs and check on Catherine and the baby. She was awake, feeding Edward. When I told her what happened, she looked concerned. "You're working too hard, Willie," she said. "Perhaps you should sleep up here, and I'll move to the guest room with Edward." I shook my head. "No, you need to rest properly. It was just a dream. I'll be fine." What a fool I was. I went back downstairs, convinced I'd imagined it all. I stoked the fire a bit, lit a lamp, and tried to get comfortable again. It took a while, but eventually exhaustion won out over fear. The second time I woke, I was facing the window. The fire had died completely, but moonlight reflected off the snow outside, casting a pale blue glow through the glass. And there she was again, but not inside the room this time. She was pressed against the window from the outside, a dark silhouette against the snowy night. But we were on the ground floor, and there was at least 3 feet of snow piled against that side of the house. How could anyone be standing there? I froze, unable to breathe. Her hands were splayed against the glass, and I could see now that the gray wasn't just a shawl. Her entire form seemed to be made of swirling gray, like smoke given shape. As I watched, her head tilted at an impossible angle, and I swear I could feel her looking at me even though I couldn't see her eyes. Panic seized me. I scrambled for the matches beside my bed, but in my haste, I knocked the entire side table over. The lamp crashed to the floor, and the noise seemed deafening in the quiet house. When I looked back at the window, she was gone. Then I felt it, a cold draft at the back of my neck. Slowly, I turned around. She was inside again at the foot of my bed, but closer now. The gray shawl seemed to move around her like it was alive, wisping and curling in a wind I couldn't feel. I'm not proud of what I did next, but fear overrode all reason. I leapt from the bed, intending to rush past her to the door, but in my panic, I aimed directly at her instead. I expected to collide with something solid, but instead, I passed right through her form. It was like diving into ice water. My entire body went cold, and I lost my balance, crashing onto the sofa against the opposite wall. Then the darkness came. Not just the absence of light. This was something tangible, something thick that pressed down on me from all sides. It filled my lungs when I tried to breathe, muffled my voice when I tried to shout. My limbs felt weighted down, immobile. I could still see the room around me, but it was as if I was looking through murky water, everything distorted and wavering. The pressure on my chest increased until I thought my ribs might crack. I couldn't call out to Catherine. I couldn't move. I was aware of the gray figure looming over me, her form expanding to fill my vision, that horrible shawl extending like tendrils toward my face. I've never been a religious man, but in that moment, I prayed. I focused every ounce of will I had left into moving just one finger, then my hand, fighting against the crushing weight. It felt like hours, but it must have been only seconds or minutes. Suddenly, with a jolt like electricity through my body, I broke free. The pressure disappeared all at once, and I fell forward onto my hands and knees, gasping for air that now came easily. The gray figure was gone, but the cold remained, seeping into my bones. I didn't wait to see if she would return. I stumbled to my feet and ran from the drawing room, not even stopping to grab a robe. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my bare feet slapping against the wood, until I reached our bedroom, where Catherine was sleeping with Edward in the cradle beside her. She woke immediately when I burst in, taking one look at my face and sitting up in alarm. "Willie, what on earth?" I must have been a frightful sight. My nightshirt was soaked with sweat despite the cold, my hair plastered to my forehead, and according to Catherine later, my face was the color of chalk. I told her everything as she wrapped blankets around me and tried to stop my shivering. When I finished, she didn't dismiss it as a nightmare. She'd known me long enough to tell the difference between a man who had a bad dream and one who had seen something that shook him to his core. We spent the rest of that night together in the master bedroom, with Edward between us. I didn't sleep, just watched the door, half expecting to see gray tendrils creeping underneath it. The next morning, I spoke with our housekeeper, Mrs. Winters, who had served my family for 20 years. I casually asked if she'd ever heard any strange stories about the house. She hesitated, then told me something that made my blood run cold. A distant cousin had stayed with us about 10 years prior, before Catherine and I were married. He'd been given the drawing room as his bedroom during his week-long visit, but had fled the house after just one night, leaving most of his belongings behind. He'd sent a letter later claiming the room was haunted and he would never set foot in our house again. My father had dismissed it as the man trying to cover embarrassment over some other reason for his hasty departure. The incident had been something of a family joke for years afterward. No one had ever taken it seriously. I never slept in the drawing room again. We rearranged the furniture the very next day, turning it back into a proper sitting room with nowhere comfortable enough to lie down. I told Catherine I'd sleep in the guest room instead when she needed space with the baby. Over the years, I've tried to understand what happened that night. Was it a ghost? Some kind of waking nightmare brought on by exhaustion? I don't know. But what I do know is that whatever was in that room wanted something from me. My name on its lips, its form reaching for me, that suffocating darkness that felt like it was draining my very life. We lived in that house for 2 more years before I found a reason to sell it and move us to a new home across town. I told Catherine it was because we needed more space for our growing family. Edward had been joined by a sister by then. But the truth was, I couldn't bear to be under that roof anymore. To this day, I've never experienced anything like it again. But sometimes, when I'm drifting off to sleep, I think I hear my name being whispered, Willie, and I jolt awake, heart pounding, half expecting to see a gray figure at the foot of my bed. Whatever it was that found me that night, I feel like it's still out there somewhere, waiting, and I pray it never finds me again. Story 7. I've been an outdoorsy person most of my life. Growing up in Pennsylvania, I spent countless weekends hiking, camping, and backpacking with my family. Even after moving to the city for work, I've always made time for wilderness trips. I'm no stranger to wildlife encounters. I've seen bears, moose, coyotes, you name it. And I know the sounds of the forest at night better than the sounds of my own apartment complex. But what happened last fall in the Virginia mountains still makes my skin crawl whenever I think about it. My cousin Tiffany and I had been planning this backcountry trip for months. We both needed to escape the constant noise and stress of our daily lives, and a remote section of the Jefferson National Forest seemed perfect. A 3-day weekend in October, right as the leaves were changing but before it got too cold to be comfortable at night. We'd researched a lesser-known trail system that promised solitude and stunning views. The drive from Richmond took longer than expected. The main highways were fine, but once we turned onto the county roads, things got progressively rougher. The last 10 miles were on a narrow gravel road with potholes that threatened to swallow my Subaru whole. When we finally reached the small clearing that served as the trailhead parking lot, I was relieved to see one other vehicle there, a dusty pickup with Virginia plates. "At least we're not completely alone out here," I said to Tiffany as we shouldered our packs. Mine was heavier, carrying our tent and cooking gear, while hers had most of our food in a bear canister. "I thought being alone was the whole point," she laughed, adjusting her hip belt. "But yeah, it's reassuring somehow." The trail started steep and stayed that way. The first 2 miles were a brutal climb through dense oak and maple forest, the fallen leaves making the path slippery in places. About an hour in, we passed the only other humans we'd see that day, a middle-aged couple heading back to the parking lot, looking tired but satisfied. "How's the trail ahead?" I asked, grateful for the chance to catch my breath. "Beautiful but tough," the man said. "We camped at Beaver Creek last night, had the whole place to ourselves." "Any wildlife?" Tiffany asked. "Just the usual, some deer, squirrels. Heard some coyotes in the distance last night, but nothing came near our camp." We thanked them and continued upward. Mid-afternoon, we'd covered about 7 miles of challenging terrain. The trail had leveled out somewhat, following a ridgeline with occasional breathtaking views of the valley below. The autumn colors were at their peak, a patchwork of crimson, orange, and gold stretching to the horizon. Around 4 o'clock, we reached a small creek that matched the description of our planned camping area. A flat clearing about 30 yards from the water looked like it had been used as a campsite before. There was a crude fire ring made of stones and a couple of logs positioned as seating. "This is perfect," Tiffany said, dropping her pack with a grateful sigh. We set up camp efficiently, having done this together many times before. The tent went up easily, our sleeping bags and pads arranged inside. I gathered firewood while Tiffany filtered water from the creek. The temperature was dropping fast as the sun dipped toward the mountains, and I was glad for the layers I'd packed. Dinner was simple but satisfying. Dehydrated chili, rehydrated over our small camp stove, with tortillas and a nip of whiskey from the flask I always bring on these trips. As darkness settled around us, I got a modest fire going in the ring. The night was incredible. Away from light pollution, the stars emerged in numbers I rarely get to see. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like spilled sugar. We sat by the fire, talking about everything and nothing, the way you can only do with someone you've known your whole life. By 10 o'clock, the fire had burned down to embers, and exhaustion from the day's hike was catching up to us. "I'm beat," Tiffany yawned. "Ready to call it a night?" I nodded, dousing the remaining coals carefully with water from the creek. We brushed our teeth, hung our food bag from a tree branch well away from our tent — black bear country requires proper precautions — and crawled into our sleeping bags. The night was cold, but not uncomfortably so, maybe in the low 40s. I fell, asleep almost immediately to the gentle sound of the creek. I have no idea how long I'd been asleep when Tiffany's hand clamped down on my arm. I startled awake, groggy and disoriented. "What?" I mumbled. "Shh," she hissed. "Listen, there's something outside." I was about to brush it off as normal forest sounds, maybe a raccoon or a possum nosing around, when I realized how tense her grip was. Tiffany's no novice in the woods either. If something had her spooked, it deserved attention. I sat up, reaching for my headlamp, but she squeezed my arm again. "No light," she whispered. "Just listen." At first, I heard nothing unusual, just the soft burble of the creek and the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. I was about to reach for my earplugs and go back to sleep when it happened. The sound. I've spent hours trying to describe it accurately since that night. It started as something like a high-pitched gobble, almost turkey-like, but then shifted into a sound I can only compare to a mountain lion's screech, except wrong somehow. It had a rhythm to it that felt deliberate, almost like speech, but no animal I know makes sounds in that pattern. It wasn't continuous, it came in bursts, each one making my heart rate spike higher. "What the fuck is that?" Tiffany whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," I answered honestly. In all my years of wilderness experience, I'd never heard anything like it. The sound came again, closer this time. It seemed to be moving along the creek, maybe 30 yards from our tent. There was a weight to it, a presence I could feel even through the thin nylon of our shelter. Whatever was making that sound was big. I found myself holding my breath, straining to hear any indication of movement, a snapping twig, rustling underbrush, anything that might tell us what kind of creature was out there. But between those unearthly vocalizations, there was nothing. It moved silently. The third time it called, the sound had shifted. Position again, now somewhere behind our tent. I felt Tiffany's hand find mine in the darkness, her fingers ice cold with fear. We sat frozen, barely breathing, as the minutes stretched painfully. Then came a different sound, a soft scraping against the outside of our tent, just inches from where I sat. Not claws or antlers, but something deliberate. I swear it sounded like fingers. "Should we make noise?" Tiffany whispered. "Try to scare it off?" Before I could answer, that bizarre call came again, so close it seemed to vibrate the very air inside our tent. My rational mind cycled through possibilities. Screech owl with a weird vocalization, some kind of fox, a mountain lion with a respiratory infection. Nothing fit. The scraping moved slowly around the perimeter of our tent. I found my Swiss Army knife in the darkness and clutched it. Though what good a 3-inch blade would do against whatever was out there, I couldn't say. My phone was useless. No signal this deep in the back country. For what felt like hours, we sat in terrified silence, listening to that thing circle our tent, occasionally making that sound that sent shivers down my spine. I kept waiting for it to lose interest, to wander back into the forest. Eventually, the sounds grew more distant, moving back toward the creek and then fading entirely. Still, we didn't dare move or speak above a whisper. "What do we do?" Tiffany finally asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Wait till morning," I said. "First light, we pack up and hike out. What if it comes back?" I had no good answer for that. We just had to hope it wouldn't. Neither of us slept again that night. We sat back to back in the middle of the tent, knives in hand, listening to every sound the forest made. Every rustle of leaves made my heart race, but that specific call never returned. When the first gray light of dawn finally filtered through the trees, we wasted no time. We packed our gear with record efficiency, skipping breakfast entirely. Neither of us wanted to spend a minute longer in that spot than necessary. The hike out was a blur of paranoia and exhaustion. We practically jogged down the trail, stopping only when absolutely necessary to drink water or adjust our packs. Every shadow in the forest seemed threatening. Every sound made us freeze and scan our surroundings. But whatever had visited us in the night was gone, or at least not showing itself. We reached the parking lot around noon. The other vehicle was gone. We threw our packs in my car and got the hell out of there, not even bothering to change out of our hiking clothes. About 20 miles down the road, we stopped at a small country market to use the bathroom and grab something to eat. While Tiffany was in the restroom, I approached the older man behind the counter. "Hey, weird question," I said, trying to sound casual. We were camping up in the mountains last night and heard something strange, kind of like... I did my best to mimic the sound, though my imitation was pathetic compared to the real thing. The man squinted at me, but before he could respond, an elderly couple by the coffee machine turned to look at me. "You heard that up there, did you?" the old woman asked, exchanging a glance with her husband. "Yeah, around 2 in the morning. Never heard anything like it before." "Count yourself lucky," the old man said, nodding sagely. "Not many folks get to hear that." I was taken aback. Lucky? It scared the hell out of us. The woman smiled, the deep wrinkles around her eyes crinkling. "Been farming these hills for 67 years. Only heard that sound 3 times myself." "But what is it?" I pressed. The elderly couple looked at each other again, some unspoken communication passing between them. "Well," the old man finally said, "some say it's a mountain lion." "That wasn't like any mountain lion I've ever heard," I countered. "Didn't say it was," he replied cryptically. "Said some believe that's what it is." "And what do you believe?" I asked. The old woman shrugged. "Been living here all my life and I still don't know for certain. Some things in these mountains, they keep their secrets." Tiffany came out of the bathroom then, and I dropped the subject. We bought some sandwiches and got back on the road, both of us processing what had happened. In the weeks since, I've spent countless hours online, listening to recordings of every animal native to the Appalachian region. I've compared hundreds of wildlife calls, read forum posts from hunters and hikers, even reached out to a biologist at Virginia Tech who specializes in local fauna. Nothing matches what we heard that night. Sometimes I wake up at 2 a.m., the sound echoing in my memory, and I lie awake wondering what was circling our tent in the Virginia mountains. Was it just some animal with an unusual vocalization, or something else entirely? All I know for certain is that something was out there with us. Something that moved without making a sound. Something that seemed to take a deliberate interest in our tent. And despite what those old-timers at the market said, I don't feel lucky at all. Story 8. I've never been the type to believe in the supernatural. Ghost stories, conspiracy theories, paranormal activity. I'd roll my eyes and move on. But after what happened last month, I'm not so sure anymore. I'm still trying to make sense of it all, and writing this down might help me process everything. Or maybe someone out there has experienced something similar and can tell me I'm not losing my mind. It all started with Malcolm. He's my cat, a sleek, gray 11-year-old tabby with these piercing yellow eyes that sometimes seem too aware. I've had him since he was about 2, rescued from a shelter after his previous owners moved away and abandoned him. He's always been different from other cats I've known, quieter, more watchful, more deliberate in his movements. I never thought much about it until I adopted Daisy, this little orange kitten, about 6 months ago. I thought Malcolm might enjoy some company since I work long hours at the office. That's when I started noticing things that didn't quite add up. Most cats are territorial at first with newcomers, but Malcolm's behavior wasn't typical aggression or jealousy. He would sit on the kitchen counter for hours, just observing Daisy playing, eating, sleeping. His head would tilt slightly whenever she did something new, like he was cataloging her behaviors, not learning to get along with her, studying her. One afternoon, I was grading papers, I'm a high school English teacher, when I witnessed something that made the hairs on my neck stand up. Malcolm was lying on my black jacket on the couch. Daisy, in full kitten mode, came bounding over to pounce on him. Just as she leapt, Malcolm disappeared. Not ran away, disappeared. I blinked and he was gone. Daisy landed on the jacket, confused, pawing at the fabric. There was no lump, No movement. Malcolm wasn't there, but I hadn't seen him leave. 30 seconds later, Malcolm stepped out from behind the TV stand across the room, looking pleased with himself. I got up and checked the jacket, lifting it completely. Nothing. No way he could have slipped away without me seeing. My apartment isn't large. It's a one-bedroom in Chicago with minimal furniture. There was nowhere for a 10-pound cat to hide on that flat couch. Then there was the bell incident. Malcolm wears a little blue collar with a bell, standard cat owner stuff to keep track of him. When he's moving around the apartment, you can hear the soft jingling. Except sometimes when he wants to, the bell goes silent. I've watched him walk across hardwood floors, jump onto counters, even run down the hallway without making a sound from that bell. It's like he can control whether you hear him or not. These little things started adding up, and one night, as I watched Malcolm sitting motionless in the window for 3 hours straight, a disturbing thought crept into my mind. What if Malcolm was bigger? What if he was my size? Would I be prey to him? The thought made me shudder. It wasn't just a random fear. It was based on the calculating look I sometimes caught in his eyes. The way he would stare at me while I slept. How he would appear in rooms without warning. 2 weeks after this realization, I got a call that changed everything. My father, who I was never close with, had passed away. We'd barely spoken in the last decade. He was a loner who preferred his isolation in northern Michigan to family connections. But surprisingly, he left me everything. 15 acres of dense forest and a cabin about 30 miles from the nearest town. I was going through a rough patch at work, feeling burnt out and underappreciated, so I decided to take a leave of absence. A few months in the woods seemed like exactly what I needed to clear my head. I arranged for a neighbor to take care of Daisy, but something told me to bring Malcolm along. Maybe it was guilt for the weird thoughts I'd been having about him. Maybe it was something else. The drive up took nearly 7 hours. Malcolm sat silently in his carrier the entire time, not making a sound, just watching the scenery change from city to suburbs to endless trees. When we finally arrived at the cabin, the sun was setting. The property was even more remote than I'd imagined. A small, rustic wooden structure surrounded by towering pines and birch trees. No neighbors, no cell service, just wilderness. The cabin itself was basic but solid. 1 bedroom, a combined kitchen-living area, a bathroom with surprisingly good water pressure, and a small covered porch that faced the densest part of the forest. My father had kept it maintained, though it was clear no one had lived there for months. I expected Malcolm to be nervous in the new environment, hiding under furniture or acting skittish, like most cats would. Instead, as soon as I opened his carrier, he walked purposefully around the cabin, sniffing corners and window frames. He seemed particularly interested in the large window in the living room that looked out on the tree line. He sat there for hours that first night, his tail twitching occasionally, eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. The first few days were uneventful. I cleaned the cabin, explored the immediate area around the property, and started reading the stack of books I'd brought. Malcolm adjusted to the cabin instantly, like he belonged there more than I did. He spent most of his time outside, disappearing into the underbrush for hours. Sometimes I'd glimpse him through the trees, moving silently despite the forest floor being covered in dry leaves and twigs. I never heard him approach. He would just suddenly be there, on the porch, waiting to be let in. Around the 5th day, Malcolm's behavior shifted. He became more alert, more vigilant. He brought me gifts, not the usual dead mice or birds that cats typically present to their owners, but arrangements of things. a perfect circle of small white stones, 3 identical pine cones placed in a row on the porch steps, a cluster of red berries that I later identified as poisonous. It felt like he was trying to communicate something, but I couldn't understand what. When he came back from his forest excursions, he seemed different, twitchy, hyper-aware, his pupils dilated. He would pace the perimeter of the cabin, stopping at each window to stare out, like he was checking for something, or guarding against something. That's when I first felt it, the sensation of being watched. Not by Malcolm, but by something else out in those trees. At night, I'd hear rustling outside, too heavy to be small forest animals. Sometimes, what sounded like footsteps would circle the cabin in the darkness. Malcolm would sit at the window, completely still, staring into the night. Not frightened, focused. On the 10th night, I woke up around 3 in the morning to find Malcolm wasn't in his usual spot at the foot of my bed. I heard a soft tapping from the living room. When I went to investigate, I found him standing on his hind legs, front paws against the window glass, tapping rhythmically. Tap, 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 pause, tap, tap, pause, like Morse code. The moonlight cast enough light through the window that I could see his reflection in the glass, except his eyes weren't reflecting the way cat's eyes normally do in darkness. They were completely black. I whispered his name, and he turned to look at me. For a split second, I swear he looked disappointed that I'd interrupted him. Then he was just Malcolm again, blinking slowly, jumping down from the windowsill to rub against my legs. The next day, I decided to follow him. It was early afternoon when Malcolm did his usual ritual of scratching at the door to be let out. Instead of watching him disappear into the trees as usual, I gave him a 5-minute head start, then followed the path I'd seen him take. The forest was unnervingly quiet that day. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush, just the occasional creak of branches in the light breeze. I followed what looked like a game trail, scanning for any sign of Malcolm's gray fur among the trees. About 10 minutes in, the trail split. I hesitated, then took the left fork, which seemed to lead deeper into the woods. The trees grew thicker here, blocking out much of the sunlight. The air felt heavier, cooler. That watching feeling returned, stronger than before. After another 5 minutes of walking, I realized I'd lost my bearings. The trail had gradually faded until I was just pushing through underbrush. I turned to go back and saw something that stopped me cold. My black jacket, the same one from my apartment, laid out neatly on the ground about 20 feet away. I hadn't brought that jacket with me. I'd left it in Chicago. As I approached it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, the entire forest went silent. Not just quiet, completely, absolutely silent. No wind, no distant sounds, nothing. I reached down to touch the jacket, confirming it was real. As my fingers brushed the fabric, I heard a soft thump behind me. I turned to find Malcolm sitting there, his back arched, tail bushy, staring past me with an intensity that made me turn back around. There was nothing visible there, just trees and shadows. But now I could hear something moving through the forest, something large, circling around us, breaking branches, heavy footfalls, getting closer. Malcolm made a sound I'd never heard from him before. Not a hiss or a growl, but a low, rhythmic vocalization that didn't sound cat-like at all, more like words in some language I couldn't understand. The moving thing stopped. Whatever it was close enough that I should have been able to see it, but there was only empty forest. Malcolm suddenly darted between my legs and took off, running back toward the cabin. Pure instinct made me follow, leaving the jacket behind. As I ran, I could hear something charging through the trees parallel to us, keeping pace easily. I never saw it clearly, just glimpses of movement, a darkness between trees that seemed deeper than it should be. We made it back to the cabin. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and collapsed on the floor, heart pounding. Malcolm sat calmly by the window again, watching the tree line, waiting. I packed our things that very afternoon. By evening, we were on the road back to Chicago. I never returned to claim my father's property. I called a real estate agent from the first town with cell service and arranged to sell it sight unseen. That was 3 weeks ago. We're back in the apartment now. Daisy was happy to see us. Things are mostly normal, except Malcolm still watches the windows more than he used to. He still disappears sometimes, even in our small apartment, and I can't figure out where he goes. The jacket I left in the woods? It showed up yesterday, folded neatly on my bed when I came home from work. And sometimes, late at night, when Malcolm is curled up asleep beside me, I hear the soft jingle of a bell moving through my apartment, even though his collar is right there around his neck, motionless. Something followed us home from those woods, something that learned from Malcolm, and I think it's still watching us. Story 9. I don't usually talk about this. I've tried to forget it for the past 6 years, but after seeing that post about the unexplained phenomena in military training grounds, I feel like I need to share what happened to me. Maybe someone else has experienced something similar, or maybe writing it out will help me make sense of it. I don't know. This happened in 2017 during a training exercise at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina. I'd been in the Corps for about 3 years at that point, long enough to know what I was doing, but not long enough to be jaded. We were doing a 3-day field exercise in a heavily wooded area that sprawls for miles beyond the main base. It's dense forest, the kind where you can't see more than 20 or 30 yards in any direction. It was day 2 of the exercise, around mid-afternoon. My squad was moving through our assigned sector when I stopped to adjust my pack and retie my boot. I told Johnson, who was behind me, that I'd catch up in a minute. It should have been simple: fix my gear and jog to catch up. But when I stood up, they were gone. It wasn't immediately alarming. We were trained to move quietly, and the foliage was thick. I headed in the direction they'd been moving, expecting to catch sight of them any second. 5 minutes passed, then 10. I started calling out, keeping my voice low at first, then progressively louder as the minutes ticked by. Nothing. I checked my compass and tried to orient myself. I knew roughly where our rendezvous point was supposed to be, so I figured I'd just head that way. I kept moving for what felt like 15 minutes, but looking at my watch, almost 45 minutes had passed. That's when I first noticed something felt off. The forest had gone completely silent. And I mean completely. If you've spent any time in the woods, you know they're never really quiet. There's always something: birds, insects, wind through the trees. But suddenly there was nothing except the sound of my own footsteps crushing leaves and twigs. I stopped walking. Complete silence. Then I heard it, a subtle rustling sound maybe 10 yards behind me. I spun around quickly, my hand instinctively moving to my sidearm. Nothing there, just trees and underbrush. I stood completely still for almost a minute, and just as I was about to start walking again, I heard it, another faint rustle. This time, it seemed to come from a different direction. This happened several more times. I'd hear something, turn to look, and find nothing. Each time the sound would stop the instant I moved to look for it, then resume from a different location when I started walking again. It was like something was circling me, keeping just out of sight. By now, the afternoon was wearing on. I pulled out my radio to try reaching my squad. Nothing but static, not even the intermittent chatter of other units I'd heard earlier. I tried different channels, adjusting the frequencies. Just static, with occasional bursts that almost sounded like distorted voices, but nothing I could make out. The light was starting to fade. In those dense woods, dusk comes early, and I knew I needed to find my way back before dark. My training kicked in: establish a direction and stick to it, find high ground if possible, look for landmarks. I picked what I thought was the direction of our camp and started moving with purpose, trying to ignore the persistent rustling sounds that continued to follow me. The temperature dropped as the light faded. It had been warm earlier, typical North Carolina spring weather. But now I felt a chill that cut right through my uniform. Not just cold, but a bone-deep chill that didn't seem natural for the season. I'd been walking for maybe another 30 minutes when I saw them. About 20 yards ahead, standing in a small clearing, were 3 Marines in full battle gear. They were standing perfectly still, facing my direction. I can't describe the relief I felt. I called out, "Hey, Lance Corporal Hayes, 3rd Battalion," and started moving toward them. They didn't respond, didn't move, just stood there. As I got closer, something felt wrong. Their uniforms looked faded, almost weathered despite the dim light. They stood unnaturally still, not at attention, but just motionless. Their faces were shadowed by their helmets, and I couldn't make out their features clearly. I was about 10 yards away when I noticed more details. One of them had what looked like a deep gouge across his chest plate. Their gear was outdated, not dramatically so, but noticeably different from our current issue. And their eyes. I could see their eyes now, and they were just staring, not blinking, not moving to track me as I approached. "Are you guys with Echo Company?" I asked, my voice sounding strange in the silence. Nothing, no response. I was about to ask again when the Marine on the left slowly, so slowly it barely registered at first, raised his arm and pointed to his right, toward what looked like a ridgeline in the distance. I stood there, frozen, as the reality of the situation started to sink in. These weren't my fellow Marines. I don't know what they were, but every instinct in my body was screaming that something was deeply wrong. Yet I didn't feel threatened. That's the strangest part. Despite everything in me saying this was unnatural, I didn't feel in danger. "Who are you?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. The pointing Marine didn't move, just kept his arm extended toward the ridgeline. The other 2 remained completely motionless. I took a step back, then another. They didn't follow, didn't turn to watch me, just stood there, the one still pointing. I had 2 choices: continue in my original direction or follow where he was pointing. My original path would take me deeper into woods that were growing darker by the minute. The ridgeline, while not where I thought camp was, at least offered higher ground and a chance to get my bearings. I chose the ridgeline. I backed away from the 3 figures, not wanting to turn my back on them. Once I was about 30 yards away, I finally turned and started moving quickly toward the higher ground they'd indicated. When I glanced back after a few minutes, they were gone, just gone. The clearing was empty. I pushed myself to move faster, the last of the daylight fading rapidly. As I ascended the gentle slope toward the ridgeline, the forest around me remained unnaturally quiet. No rustling sounds followed me now, just silence. It took me about 20 minutes to reach the top of the ridge. From there, I could see lights in the distance, our camp. It was maybe 2 miles away, in almost the opposite direction from where I'd been heading. If I'd continued on my original path, I would have gone miles in the wrong direction, deeper into some of the most isolated parts of the training grounds. I made it back to camp just as full darkness set in. My sergeant was the first person I saw, and the look on his face when I walked up was a mix of relief and anger. "Hayes, where the hell have you been? We've had search parties out for the last 3 hours." I explained what happened, how I'd gotten separated and lost my bearings. I didn't mention the strange silence or the rustling sounds, but I did ask about the 3 Marines I'd encountered. "Did you send another unit out?" "I ran into 3 Marines about 2 miles east of here. They pointed me toward camp." The sergeant's expression changed. The anger drained away, replaced by something I couldn't read. "We didn't send anyone in that direction. All search parties were moving west from our position. Everyone else is accounted for." "Well, someone was out there," I insisted. 3 Marines in full gear. One had damage to his chest plate. They didn't speak, just pointed me toward the ridge. The sergeant exchanged looks with my platoon leader, who had walked up during our conversation. "Get some food and rest, Hayes," the sergeant finally said. "We'll debrief in the morning." That night, as we settled in, an older Marine named Rodriguez sat down next to me. He'd been with the Corps for nearly 15 years and was on his last tour before retirement. "Heard you got lost today," he said quietly. I nodded. "Also heard you saw 3 Marines who helped you find your way back." I looked at him, surprised. "Yeah, silent guys. Wouldn't speak, just pointed the way." Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment. "Didn't the sergeant tell you?" "Tell me what?" He looked around to make sure no one was listening too closely. "About 12 years ago, 3 Marines went missing during a training exercise in those same woods. Search went on for days. They never found them. Not them, not their gear, nothing. Just vanished." My skin went cold. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying there have been stories since then. Guys who get separated, lost in those woods. Some of them report seeing 3 Marines who never speak, just stand there or point directions. Sometimes they lead guys back to safety. Other times," he trailed off. "Other times what?" "Other times the Marines who follow them are never seen again." Rodriguez stood up. "You're lucky, Hayes. Whatever you saw out there, they wanted you to come back." I barely slept that night, and the next day, when I tried to talk to the sergeant about what Rodriguez had told me, he shut me down immediately. "We don't discuss that ghost story, Hayes. It's bad for morale. You got lost, you found your way back. End of story." But it wasn't the end. Over the next few days, I asked around discreetly. Most of the younger guys hadn't heard anything, but a few of the veterans knew the story. The details varied. Some said the 3 Marines had been killed by friendly fire and it was covered up. Others said they'd walked into some kind of sinkhole or natural trap in the woods. One guy even suggested they'd deserted, and the ghost story was created to discourage others. Whatever the truth, I know what I saw. Those weren't living men standing in that clearing. Their stillness, their eyes, the way they vanished, it wasn't natural. And sometimes when I'm half asleep, I can still see that Marine's arms slowly rising to point the way, still feel the unnatural silence of those woods pressing in around me. I've never gone back to that part of the training grounds, and I requested a transfer to a different unit 6 months later. I've told myself 1,000 times that there must be a rational explanation, that stress and disorientation played tricks on my mind, but deep down, I know better. Whatever I encountered in those woods, they weren't human soldiers, and I still wonder why they chose to guide me back when so many others, according to the stories, were never seen again. Story 10. I've been putting this off for years, but but I need to get it out there. I've tried telling this to people, but they either laugh or look at me like I'm crazy, so maybe someone here will listen. 4 years ago, me and 3 of my closest friends decided to go camping in Yellowwood State Forest, about an hour from where we lived in Indiana. It was supposed to be a simple weekend thing, just me, Jake, Mia, Ethan, and Hannah. We'd been planning it for a couple weeks because we were all stressed from college and needed a break somewhere peaceful. We packed up Ethan's old Subaru on a Friday afternoon in late September. The weather was perfect, not too hot, not too cold. We had 2 tents, food for 3 days, and enough beer to keep us happy. Ethan had researched this spot that was off the main trails, nothing crazy remote, but far enough that we wouldn't run into other hikers. We got there around 4 in the afternoon and hiked about 45 minutes to reach this small clearing Ethan had found on some hiking forum. It was beautiful, tall trees all around, but open enough to see the sky. We set up camp pretty quickly, with Mia and Hannah sharing one tent while Ethan and I took the other. The first few hours were exactly what we wanted. We collected firewood, got a nice fire going, cooked hot dogs, and just sat around talking and drinking. The sun was setting, and you could see stars starting to appear. Hannah was pointing out constellations. She was an astronomy major and knew all that stuff. Everything was normal, everything was fine, until it wasn't. It must have been around 11 at night. We were all tipsy but not drunk, sitting around the fire telling those stupid, scary stories you tell when camping. Ethan was halfway through some story about a hitchhiker when we heard it. A scream, a woman's scream, but not like someone was startled or hurt. This was different. It started almost human, but twisted into something else by the end, like someone was trying to imitate what a woman's scream should sound like, but didn't quite get it right. We all froze. Mia whispered, "What the hell was that?" Ethan tried to laugh it off. Probably just a mountain lion or something, but his voice cracked. "There aren't mountain lions in Indiana anymore," Hannah said quietly. We sat in silence for a few minutes, straining to hear anything else. Part of me hoped it was just some animal I wasn't familiar with, but deep down, I knew better. "Maybe we should head back in the morning," Mia suggested. Nobody argued. We decided to stay up a bit longer, keep the fire going strong. Nobody wanted to be alone in a tent after that. We were all trying to act normal, but you could feel the tension. Every crack of a twig made us jump. Then we heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, uneven footsteps moving through the underbrush surrounding our clearing. Not like someone walking normally, more like a dragging, limping gait. Like something was injured but still moving with purpose. "Hello?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. "Someone there?" No response, just those footsteps circling around our campsite, just beyond where our firelight reached. I grabbed my flashlight, one of those heavy mag lights that could double as a weapon if needed. The others huddled closer to the fire. I stood up and pointed the beam toward where the sounds were coming from. At first, I saw nothing, just trees and darkness. Then something moved between 2 pines about 30 yards away, something with a tail. I only caught a glimpse, but it looked like a tail with patchy, scraggly fur, swinging awkwardly behind whatever was moving. "There's something out there," I whispered, keeping my light trained on that spot. The footsteps continued, moving around to another side of our camp. I swung my light to follow the sound. That's when I saw it, or part of it. Just for a second, my light caught what looked like a leg, not an animal's leg. Something more human-shaped, but wrong, twisted, like the bones had been broken and healed at odd angles. It disappeared behind a tree before I could see more. "What is it?" Hannah asked, her voice barely audible. "I don't know," I said honestly, "but it's big." We could hear it breathing now, heavy, raspy breaths that sometimes dipped into a low growl, not like a dog or wolf, something deeper, more guttural. "Should we run?" Mia asked. Ethan shook his head. "No way. We'd never make it back to the car in the dark, and we'd get separated." He was right. Whatever this thing was, it was between us and the trail back. Running would be suicide, so we stayed put. We built the fire up as big as we could, grabbing every stick and branch within reach of our campsite. Nobody wanted to venture any further into the darkness. For what felt like hours, we sat there, backs to each other, facing outward toward the darkness. The thing kept circling, never coming into the light, but never leaving either. Sometimes it would stop moving for 10 or 15 minutes, and we'd think maybe it had left. Then we'd hear those uneven footsteps again, continuing their circle. Around 3 in the morning, it started making this sound. Not quite the scream from before, but a low, droning moan that rose and fell in pitch, like it was trying to sing but didn't understand how. That was worse than the footsteps somehow. It made the hair on my arms stand up. Hannah was crying silently beside me. Mia kept whispering, "Please go away," under her breath. Ethan just stared into the darkness, completely still. I kept thinking about what we'd do if it finally decided to come into the light. We had my mag light and Ethan's pocket knife. That was it. Whatever was out there sounded big enough that those wouldn't do much. The sky was starting to lighten around 5:30 in the morning. Slowly, the footsteps became more distant. The breathing faded. By the time the sun was actually rising, we couldn't hear it anymore. We waited until full daylight before any of us dared to move from our spots around the dying fire. We were exhausted, stiff, and terrified. "We need to pack up and get out of here," Ethan said. No one argued. We moved quickly, throwing our stuff into our packs with none of the care we'd used setting up. No one wanted to be in that forest a second longer than necessary. Before we left, though, I had to look. I had to see if there was any sign of what had been stalking us all night. I walked carefully to the edge of our clearing, where I'd seen that twisted leg disappear behind a tree. The others watched me nervously but didn't follow. The ground there was soft from recent rain, and there were tracks, not animal tracks like deer or bear. These were, I still don't know how to describe them properly. One set looked almost like human footprints, but too large and misshapen, with what appeared to be claw marks at the ends where toes should be. Alongside these were deeper gouges in the earth, like something had been dragging. I followed the tracks for about 20 feet before they disappeared into rockier ground. They circled our entire campsite, just as we'd heard during the night. "Jake, come on," Mia called. "Please, let's just go." I took a quick picture with my phone, which I still have but nobody ever believes is anything but animal tracks, and we left. The hike back to the car was tense. Every sound made us jump. We kept looking over our shoulders. When we finally reached Ethan's Subaru, we threw our gear in and got the hell out of there. No one spoke much on the drive home. Later, we tried to rationalize what happened. Ethan suggested a bear with mange or some kind of deformity. Mia thought maybe it was someone messing with us, though who would wander miles into the forest at night just to scare some random campers? I spent weeks researching animal sounds, trying to match that scream to something known. Nothing fits. Not bobcats, not foxes, not any wildlife native to Indiana forests. We all agreed never to go camping again, at least not anywhere remote. Hannah and Mia won't talk about it anymore. Ethan makes jokes about our Bigfoot encounter when he's drunk, but I can tell it still bothers him. As for me, I can't shake it. 4 years later, and I still wake up sometimes thinking I hear that scream in the distance. When I'm alone in my apartment at night, I swear I can sometimes hear those uneven footsteps outside my door. I've checked every time. There's never anything there. I've never gone back to Yellowwood. I never will. But I wonder if it's still there, circling some other campus fire, watching and waiting just beyond the light. Whatever it was, whatever it is, I know one thing for certain. It wasn't anything natural, and I don't think it was just watching us. I think it was deciding. I just don't know what it was deciding, and that's what keeps me up at night. Story 11. I've never shared this with anyone outside my family before, but I need to get this off my chest. Even 10 years later, I still get chills thinking about it. Sometimes I convince myself it was just my imagination running wild after a bad breakup, but deep down, I know what I saw was real. It all started after Miguel and I broke up. We'd been together for almost 2 years, and the split wasn't pretty. 3 weeks later, he was already dating this girl named Valeria. I didn't know her well, just that she lived on the outskirts of town and had a reputation. People called her a brucha behind her back. I thought it was just small-town gossip. You know how people talk. I first met Valeria at the grocery store about a month after she started dating Miguel. She was in the produce section, and I swear she was waiting for me. Our eyes locked, and instead of looking away like normal people do, she just stared. Then she smiled, but not in a friendly way. More like she was sizing me up. I quickly grabbed what I needed and left, but I could feel her eyes on my back the whole time. After that, I kept running into her everywhere. The gas station, the pharmacy, even outside my workplace. It was like she was deliberately placing herself in my path. Each time she'd give me that same unsettling smile. My friend Lucia had been to one of Valeria's parties and told me some weird stuff. Apparently, Valeria would host these gatherings where she'd burn strange-smelling herbs and lead everyone in what she called energy circles. Lucia said she left early because the whole thing felt off, especially when Valeria started chanting in some language no one understood. The cats thing was especially disturbing. Valeria had owned 7 cats in just the past year, according to neighborhood gossip. Each one died mysteriously, and she'd just replaced them with another. Someone claimed they saw her burying something in her backyard at midnight, but nobody wanted to ask questions. About 2 months after Miguel started dating her, I had this dream that still makes my skin crawl. In it, I was lying in bed when my window slowly opened by itself. A bunch of black smoke poured in and formed the shape of a woman. I couldn't move or scream. The smoke woman leaned over me, and I could make out Valeria's face in it. She whispered something in my ear that I couldn't understand, then dissolved and seemed to sink into my chest. I woke up gasping for air and drenched in sweat. The next morning, I called my mom in a panic. Mom's family is from a small village in Mexico, and they've always been more open to the idea of supernatural things. When I told her about the dream and everything else, she didn't dismiss it like I expected. Instead, she told me to come over right away. I drove to my parents' house, and Mom listened to everything. She told me stories about lechosas, shape-shifting witches from our region who could transform into animals and cast spells on people. According to her, they often targeted people out of jealousy or revenge. When I mentioned Miguel, Mom nodded knowingly. "She probably did something to make him leave you," she said, completely serious. These women, they know old ways to confuse a man's heart. I wasn't sure I believed all that, but Mom seemed so certain. She gave me a small pouch filled with herbs and told me to keep it with me at all times. Then she insisted on blessing me with holy water she kept in a special bottle from church. It was getting dark when I left my parents' house. The road back to my apartment cuts through some wooded areas, and there aren't many streetlights. I was about halfway home when I saw something that made me slam on my brakes. There, perched on a fence post right next to the road, was the biggest owl I've ever seen. But something was terribly wrong with it. Its face wasn't like a normal owl's. It was pale and almost human-looking. And its eyes, God, its eyes were completely black, like two pits staring right through me. Not animal eyes at all, human eyes. Valeria's eyes. I screamed and pointed, but Mom, who was following me home in her car, didn't see anything when she pulled up behind me. The owl, or whatever it was, had vanished. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. "I saw it, Mom," I kept saying. "It had her face, it had her eyes." Mom went very quiet before telling me something she'd never shared before. Back when she was young, before moving to the States, she'd seen something similar. A large bird with human-like features watching her from a tree. And my father, who's the most skeptical person I know, had once encountered a strange animal that changed shape as it ran across the road in front of his truck. "These things follow families sometimes," she whispered. "They find something in our blood that calls to them." Mom insisted on following me all the way home and coming inside to check my apartment. My boyfriend Javier was there, worried about why I was so late. When Mom left, I told him everything. He tried to comfort me, saying it was just stress and an overactive imagination, but I could tell he was disturbed. We went to bed around 11 that night. I was exhausted but afraid to close my eyes. Javier fell asleep quickly, but I just lay there, listening to every little sound. Around 1 in the morning, I heard it, a scratching noise coming from the roof, right above our bedroom. At first, I told myself it was just tree branches, or maybe squirrels. But then came the thudding sounds, like something heavy walking back and forth. Javier woke up too, and I could see in his face that this wasn't just branches. "Stay here," he whispered, grabbing the baseball bat he kept next to the bed. "No," I hissed, clutching his arm. "Don't go out there." But he insisted, and I followed him to the door, terrified of being left alone. We stepped outside, and Javier shined his phone flashlight up at the roof. There was nothing there, no animal, no person, nothing that could have made those sounds. As we stood there looking up, all the streetlights on our block suddenly went out. Just like that. Darkness. In that moment of pitch black, before Javier's flashlight came back on, I heard something like wings flapping, huge wings, right over our heads. We ran back inside and locked every door and window. Neither of us slept that night. The scratching and thudding didn't return, but something else happened that was almost worse. Complete silence. No crickets, no distant traffic sounds. Nothing. Just dead silence all around our apartment, like we were sealed in a vacuum. The next morning, I called in sick to work. Javier stayed home too, though he tried to act like everything was fine in the daylight. I called my sister Anna, who I remembered had briefly roomed with Valeria before she started dating Miguel. Anna had moved out after just 3 weeks, claiming Valeria made her uncomfortable. What Anna told me made my blood run cold. One night, she'd gotten up to use the bathroom and noticed light coming from under Valeria's door. Curious, she peeked through the keyhole and saw Valeria kneeling in front of some kind of altar. There were candles, small figurines, and bowls of what looked like blood. But the worst part was what Anna saw next to the altar. a white candle with my name carved into it. Above it, a knife was stabbed into the wall. Anna moved out the next day, too scared to confront Valeria. She'd been too afraid to tell me until now. She told me once that she'd been watching Miguel for months before you broke up, Anna admitted. She said she knew how to make anyone fall in love with her. I thought she was just being dramatic, but now I don't know. Over the next few days, the incidents continued. Our power would cut out randomly. Things would be moved from where we left them. 3 times, we found dead birds on our doorstep. No visible injuries, just dead. And the dreams came back, that smoke forming into a woman, whispering things I couldn't understand but somehow knew were threats. I went to Miguel's workplace, desperate to talk to him. He seemed different, distant, like he was half asleep. When I mentioned Valeria, his eyes glazed over completely. He said she was the most amazing woman he'd ever met, but it sounded rehearsed, like someone else's words coming out of his mouth. "Has she made you drink anything unusual?" I asked, remembering what my mom had said about love potions. He just laughed, but there was no humor in it. A week later, Miguel and Valeria suddenly moved away. No goodbyes, no forwarding address. Their apartment was emptied overnight. The only thing left behind was a strange symbol painted on the bedroom wall, a spiral with what looked like claw marks through it. The scratching on our roof stopped. The nightmares faded. Life slowly returned to normal, except for one thing. I still can't shake the feeling of being watched sometimes. And every now and then, usually when I'm driving alone at night, I'll catch a glimpse of something large flying overhead, just at the edge of my headlights. I've tried researching bruxas and lechosas, tried to understand what happened. Some sources say these witches can hold grudges for generations. Others say they're drawn to certain bloodlines. Whatever the truth is, I know what I experienced wasn't just stress or imagination. My mom still insists I wear the herb pouch she gave me whenever I go out after dark. Javier and I are married now, with a baby on the way, and sometimes I worry. What if this thing, whatever it is, doesn't just follow me? What if it follows my child too? Last month, I was hanging laundry in our backyard when I found a small cloth doll tucked behind the dryer. It had black thread wrapped around its neck and what looked like my hair woven into it. I burned it immediately and scattered the ashes. I don't know if Valeria is still practicing her craft somewhere, or if what she set in motion is just continuing on its own. All I know is that the border between what we can explain and what we can't is thinner than most people realize. Some nights, when the wind makes those scratching sounds against our windows, I find myself looking up, half expecting to see that owl with the human face and those pitch-black eyes staring back at me. And sometimes, I swear I do. Story 12. I've been guiding safaris in the Lowveld for almost 17 years now. After all this time, you develop a sixth sense about the bush, the way the air changes when predators are near, how birds signal danger, and when something just feels off. But what happened last month still keeps me up at night, and I'm struggling to make sense of it. It was the third night of a 5-day walking trail through one of the more remote sections of the reserve. Walking safaris are completely different from vehicle tours. You're fully exposed, following animal paths, reading tracks, and becoming part of the ecosystem rather than just passing through it in a protective metal shell. I was leading with my colleague Ben, an experienced guide I've worked with for years. We had 4 German tourists with us, a retired couple and their adult children, all experienced travelers who'd specifically requested a more authentic wilderness experience. That particular day had been especially tiring. We'd walked about 15 kilometers, following a herd of elephants for part of the morning, before veering off toward our planned camping area. The weather had turned unusually cold for that time of year, and by late afternoon, I noticed our guests were getting exhausted. We decided to make camp a bit earlier than planned, finding a flat area about 50 meters from a dry riverbed. Setting up camp in the bush isn't like regular camping. We use small, lightweight dome tents. Nothing fancy, just simple canvas shelters. The most important thing is how you arrange them. We always set up in a rough circle with the cooking area in the center, and Ben and I position our tents strategically on opposite sides to keep watch. That night, I placed my tent facing the riverbed, thinking I'd hear any animals coming from that direction. After dinner around the campfire, I briefed the group like I always do. Remember, no food in your tents. If you need to use the bathroom during the night, wake one of us first. Don't leave your tent alone. Standard procedure, but absolutely crucial. The temperature had dropped dramatically, and everyone was keen to get into their sleeping bags. By 10, the camp was quiet. I must have fallen asleep quickly. The days are physically demanding, and I've learned to get rest whenever possible. I'm not sure what time it was when I woke up, maybe 1 or 2 in the morning, but something felt immediately wrong. My first conscious sensation was warmth and pressure against my back, through the tent wall. In my groggy state, I thought maybe my backpack had fallen against the side of the tent, or perhaps Ben was playing a joke, though that would have been completely out of character during a tour. As I became more alert, I realized the warmth was rhythmic. Whatever was pressing against my tent was breathing, slowly, deliberately, and powerfully. My body went rigid as my mind raced through possibilities. A buffalo? No, the breathing pattern was wrong. Elephant? Too deliberate, and they rarely lie down. My heart started pounding as I realized what was likely pressed against my tent. A lion. I've encountered lions hundreds of times in my career, but always with some kind of advantage, in a vehicle or at a safe distance or up in a tree. Now there was literally nothing between me and what I suspected was one of Africa's apex predators, except a thin layer of canvas. The pressure against my back suggested the animal was actually leaning against my tent, perhaps even lying against it. The tent fabric moved slightly with each breath the creature took. I could feel its body heat. I could hear what sounded like the subtle shifting of its weight. I was terrified to move, worried that any sudden movement might trigger a predatory response. Lions have incredible hearing and can detect the slightest sounds. I lay perfectly still, barely breathing myself, when I heard Ben's whisper from his tent about 20 meters away. "Thabo, are you awake?" His voice was barely audible, but in the dead silence of the bush night, it carried. The moment I whispered back, "Yes," I felt the creature shift. There was a pause, then a low, deep huffing sound. Not a growl, not aggressive, just acknowledging. Then movement. The warmth and pressure left my tent wall as I heard the unmistakable sound of heavy paws crushing dry leaves. 4 distinct footfalls moving away, then silence. Ben and I stayed frozen, communicating in whispers so quiet I could barely hear him. "What was it?" he asked. "I think lion," I replied. "Male. Big. The guests?" Still quiet. "Let's not wake them." We stayed awake for the rest of the night, listening to every sound. I kept my hand on my rifle, though I knew using it would be an absolute last resort. The hours crawled by as we waited for dawn. The coldest part of the night came just before sunrise. and I found myself shivering, partly from the temperature drop, partly from delayed shock. As the first gray light filtered through the trees, Ben and I emerged from our tents simultaneously. We exchanged a look that said everything without words. Then we did what guides do. We assessed the situation, professionally. The tracks were unmistakable in the sandy soil around camp. A large male lion had circled our entire camp, walking methodically around each tent. The prints showed where he had paused by the cold ashes of our fire, then continued directly to my tent. There, the tracks transformed from a walking pattern to a lying position, a clear depression in the ground right against the side of my tent where I had been sleeping. The tracks continued away from camp, following the riverbed for about half a kilometer before turning into thicker bush. Ben and I followed them just far enough to confirm the lion had moved on, then hurried back to prepare breakfast before our guests woke up. "Should we tell them?" Ben asked as we boiled water for coffee. I considered it carefully. "No, we're moving camp today anyway. No sense causing panic." When our German clients emerged from their tents, we greeted them normally, asking if they'd slept well. They had no idea what had happened, and we kept it that way. Just another morning in the bush for them. But as I packed up my tent, my hands wouldn't stop shaking. The reality of what had happened was sinking in. A full-grown male lion, likely the dominant male we'd spotted 2 days earlier, judging by the size of the tracks, had deliberately settled against my tent. He hadn't been stalking us or showing aggression. The night had been unusually cold, and he had simply sought warmth. The most dangerous predator in the region had spent part of the night pressed against my tent with nothing but thin fabric between us. By all logic, he should have detected my scent, my heartbeat, my presence. Lions have incredible senses. He knew I was there. He had to know. What's been haunting me since that night isn't fear, but a profound realization. The same basic instinct that had driven me to curl up in my sleeping bag for warmth had led this powerful predator to find the warmest object nearby, my tent, with my body heat radiating through it. Despite having every evolutionary advantage, strength, teeth, claws, hunting instincts, he had chosen comfort over conflict. We moved camp that morning as planned, trekking another 10 kilometers to our next site. The tour continued without incident, and our guests left with photos and stories of elephants, giraffes, and distant lion sightings. They never knew about their closest encounter. It's been 4 weeks, and I've led 2 more tours since then. But something has changed in me. Every night in my tent, I'm aware of what's on the other side of the canvas in a way I never was before. I've started positioning my sleeping mat in the center of the tent, away from the walls. I listen more intently to the night sounds. What stays with me isn't just how close I came to death, but how arbitrary survival can be in the wilderness. All my training, all my experience, all my precautions, none of that mattered that night. What saved me wasn't skill or preparation, but simply that a lion made a choice. The bush has taught me many lessons over the years, but this one cuts deepest. Control is an illusion out here. Sometimes you live or die based on decisions made by creatures whose minds we can never truly understand. I still can't explain why that lion chose to rest against my tent rather than tear through it. I don't know why he left when he did, and I don't know if I'll ever stop feeling that phantom pressure and warmth against my back when I lie down to sleep. Story 13. I've been a trucker for 17 years now, crossed every state in the continental US, driven through blizzards, sandstorms, you name it. But what happened last July in southern Utah still keeps me up at night. I've never told anyone the full story until now because, well, I'm not sure anyone would believe me. Hell, I'm not sure I believe it myself. It was the height of monsoon season. I was hauling a load of electronics from Denver to Vegas, running a bit behind schedule after some delays at the distribution center. My dispatcher was riding my ass about making up time, so I decided to take a shortcut through some of the more desolate parts of southern Utah. Route 95, if you're familiar with it. Not many towns, just miles of red rock badlands and sagebrush. The weather report mentioned possible storms, but nothing severe. I figured I could beat whatever was coming. Big mistake. Around 4 in the afternoon, the sky turned this sickly greenish-black color. The temperature dropped about 15 degrees in 10 minutes. I've seen some nasty weather in my time, but something about this felt different. Wrong somehow. The rain hit like someone had flipped a switch. 1 second dry, the next I could barely see past my windshield wipers on their highest setting. My truck, a 2016 Peterbilt I've nicknamed Betty, started rocking from the wind. Then the hail came. Not your typical pea-sized stuff, but chunks the size of golf balls hammering the cab so loud I had to crank my radio to hear anything. I slowed to maybe 30 miles per hour, white-knuckling the steering wheel. Visibility was maybe 20 feet at best. The road was winding through some hills, and I was taking each curve with extreme caution. I hadn't seen another vehicle for at least 40 minutes. That's when I rounded a bend and saw it. At first, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. A wall of bright orange flames, maybe 20 feet high, stretching across the landscape as far as I could see in both directions. The fire was burning the ground itself, rocks, dirt, everything. Despite the torrential downpour, these flames were roaring, creating this bizarre steam that mixed with the black smoke. I hit the brakes, skidding slightly on the wet asphalt. Coming to a stop about 50 yards from where the fire approached the roadside. I remember rubbing my eyes, thinking I was hallucinating from exhaustion. Long hauls will do that to you sometimes, make you see things that aren't there. But this was different. I could feel the heat, even through the closed windows of my cab, with the AC blasting and 50 yards away. I could feel the intense heat radiating from the flames. The windshield was actually hot to the touch. This was real. The scene was like something from a nightmare or a biblical painting, fire and water locked in combat. The rain would hit the flames and instantly turn to steam, creating this bizarre hissing sound that somehow cut through the drumming of the hail on my roof. The flames themselves weren't behaving like normal fire. They didn't flicker much in the wind. They stood tall, almost defiant against the storm. I sat there for maybe 5 minutes, just staring. My CB radio was nothing but static. Cell service was non-existent, as expected in that remote area. I was completely alone with this impossible phenomenon. The logical part of my brain tried to make sense of it. Gas line rupture? But there aren't any major pipelines through that desolate stretch. Lightning strike? But what fuel could sustain flames that high in a downpour? Nothing made sense. I noticed something else strange. The flames seemed to be moving, not spreading like a normal fire, but shifting almost purposefully, like they were searching for something. The fire line would bulge in one spot, recede in another, creating these bizarre, almost geometric patterns across the landscape. I had a decision to make: turn around and find another route, adding hours to my already delayed trip, or press forward and hope the road itself wasn't compromised. The fire hadn't quite reached the asphalt yet, though it was burning right up to the shoulder in some spots. After a few minutes of deliberation, I decided to push forward. The road itself seemed clear, and if I drove fast enough, I figured I could make it past the worst of it. I put Betty in gear and started creeping forward, heart pounding in my chest. As I got closer, the heat became almost unbearable. The cab felt like an oven despite the AC working overtime. The rubber seals around my windows started to smell funny, that burning plastic odor. My skin felt tight, like I was getting a sunburn in real time. I accelerated, pushing to about 40 miles per hour, trying to get through as quickly as possible while still maintaining control on the wet road. The wall of fire extended for maybe a quarter mile along the highway. As I drove parallel to it, I kept glancing over, unable to look away, despite the danger of taking my eyes off the road. That's when I saw something that still haunts me. Within the fire, maybe 100 feet from the road, I swear I saw a silhouette. Not of a person exactly, but something upright. Something watching me. It was just for a split second. A darker shadow within the orange flames. Vaguely humanoid, but wrong in proportions. Too tall, too thin. And I had the overwhelming sense it was aware of me. I jerked my eyes back to the road, nearly swerving off the shoulder in panic. When I looked back again, the shape was gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. As I reached the halfway point of this fire corridor, something even stranger happened. The flames nearest the road began to recede, almost like they were being pushed back by an invisible force. It created a wider buffer between my truck and the inferno, almost like the fire was giving me passage. I'm not a religious man, but I started praying under my breath. Every instinct was screaming at me to floor it, to get away as fast as possible. But I kept my speed steady, afraid of hydroplaning or losing control. The noise was deafening. The combination of the hail, the rain, the roar of the flames, and the constant hissing of water turning instantly to steam created this hellish symphony. My ears were actually ringing from it, like I'd been at a rock concert. About 3/4 of the way through, I noticed something, metallic glinting deep within the flames, off to the right. It was only visible for a moment before being swallowed again by the inferno, but it looked like part of a vehicle, maybe a trailer or large truck. That was the first moment I considered that this might have a rational explanation. A tanker truck accident. Finally, I cleared the wall of fire. In my rearview mirrors, I could see the bizarre scene growing smaller. That impossible line where fire and flood met in stalemate. I drove another 10 miles at high speed before the shaking in my hands subsided enough for me to pull over. I sat there for maybe 20 minutes, just breathing, trying to process what I'd seen. The storm was starting to let up, the hail replaced by a steady rain. I grabbed my thermos of coffee, but found I couldn't drink it. The heat of the liquid brought back the overwhelming sensation of that wall of flame. When I finally calmed down enough to think clearly, I tried my cell phone again. Still no service. I checked my GPS, confirming I was about 40 miles from the nearest town, Hanksville. I decided to press on, report what I'd seen when I reached civilization. By the time I rolled into Hanksville, the storm had passed completely. The sun was setting, casting an eerie orange glow not unlike the flames I'd witnessed. At the only gas station in town, I asked the attendant if they'd heard anything about a fire or truck accident back on Route 95. The young guy behind the counter nodded, looking grim. Yeah, propane truck lost control in the storm, went off the road about 3 hours ago. Highway patrol said the tank ruptured and ignited. Been burning ever since. They can't get near it to put it out. too dangerous with all that fuel. I felt a weird mix of relief and unease. There was a logical explanation after all, but it didn't account for everything I'd seen. The way the fire moved, that silhouette, the strange feeling of being watched. "Anyone hurt?" I asked, trying to sound casual. The attendant shrugged. "Don't know about the driver. They haven't found him yet." I nodded, paid for my diesel, and got back on the road. I should have felt better knowing there was a rational explanation, but I didn't. Something still felt deeply wrong about what I'd witnessed. Over the next few days, I kept checking news sites for updates on the accident. There wasn't much, just a brief mention of a propane transport losing control during the storm, causing a fire that took emergency crews nearly 7 hours to contain. Nothing about the driver. It's been 4 months now, and I still can't shake what happened. Every time it rains, I think about that wall of flame defying nature, burning despite the deluge. I think about that silhouette watching me from within the inferno, and I wonder about the driver of that propane truck, if they were consumed by the flames, or if something else happened to them. Last week I had to make the same Denver-Vegas run again. I took the long way around, adding 3 hours to my drive time. My dispatcher wasn't happy, but I don't care. I'll never drive that stretch of Route 95 again. Sometimes at night, when I'm parked at some truck stop trying to sleep, I'll jolt awake with the certainty that I'm being watched. I'll pull back the privacy curtain of my sleeper cab and scan the parking lot, half expecting to see that elongated silhouette standing in the darkness, observing me. The rational part of my brain says it was just a terrible accident, combined with my exhaustion and the bizarre weather conditions. That the silhouette was just a trick of the flames. That the feeling of being watched was just adrenaline and fear. But there's another part of me that knows different. That knows I witnessed something that day that can't be explained by ruptured propane tanks or freak weather. Something ancient and aware that exists in the meeting place of opposing forces, fire and water, creation and destruction. I've never told another soul about this, until now. I'm not sure why I'm sharing it here, except that I need someone else to know. Because sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if whatever was watching me that day is still watching, waiting for me to return to that desolate stretch of Utah highway. And worse, I wonder if a part of me wants to go back and find out. Story 14. I've always been a cat person. When I adopted Milo 3 years ago from the local shelter, I thought I knew what I was getting into. An orange tabby with big green eyes who knocked over everything in his path. Seriously, this cat couldn't jump onto a windowsill without taking down a plant, a picture frame, or both. The shelter staff even joked that he should come with his own insurance policy. For the first year, Milo was exactly as advertised. Loving, playful, and comically uncoordinated. He'd chase laser pointers right into walls and somehow manage to fall off the couch while sleeping. I bought him a collar with a bell specifically because he was so clumsy that I needed to track his whereabouts to prevent household disasters. Everything changed last winter. I live in an older 2-story house in a suburban neighborhood about 30 minutes outside the city. Nothing fancy, just a modest place with character, and apparently with mouse-friendly entry points I hadn't noticed before. When temperatures dropped in November, I started hearing scratching in the walls at night. At first I tried ignoring it. Then I saw the first mouse dart across my kitchen floor while I was making dinner. I nearly dropped my pan. The next day I bought traps and set them around the house, but caught nothing. Meanwhile, the scratching in the walls multiplied. I started finding droppings in cabinets and gnawed packages in the pantry. One morning, about 2 weeks into the mouse invasion, I walked into the kitchen and froze. Milo was sitting perfectly still next to the refrigerator, staring at a small gap between it and the wall. This wasn't his usual posture. His entire body was lowered, shoulders hunched, ears forward, and despite the bell on his collar, he wasn't making a sound, not a single jingle. I watched him, fascinated. For 15 minutes, he didn't move a muscle. Just when I was about to walk away, he suddenly shot forward in a blur of orange. There was no sound, no bell, no pause on the floor, nothing. Then he emerged with a mouse in his mouth. I was shocked, but also relieved. Problem solved, right? Little did I know what I was witnessing was the beginning of something that would eventually keep me awake at night. Over the next few days, Milo caught 6 more mice. Each time followed the same pattern: silent stalking, impossible stillness, and then a kill so quick I could barely track the movement. The bell never rang, not once. I started paying closer attention to him. During normal activities, eating, playing, jumping on furniture, the bell jingled constantly, exactly as it should. But the moment he detected a mouse, something changed. It was like watching a switch flip. His eyes would dilate, his body would lower, and he'd move like a shadow. The transformation was unsettling. Out of curiosity, I decided to document where he made his kills, thinking it might help me locate entry points. I grabbed a notepad and drew a rough layout of my house, marking X's where Milo had caught mice. After a couple weeks, the pattern became clear. Most activity centered around the kitchen, the living room wall that faced the backyard, and the basement door. One weekend, I sealed every crack and crevice in those areas. I stuffed steel wool into tiny holes, applied caulk around pipes, and installed new weather stripping on exterior doors. The mouse problem decreased significantly, but didn't disappear entirely. What did change was my perception of Milo. I'd always viewed him as this goofy, harmless companion who couldn't manage to drink from his water bowl without spilling half of it. Now I found myself watching him differently, noticing things I'd overlooked. How he tracked movement with microscopic precision. How he could jump from floor to counter in one fluid motion when motivated. How he'd stare intently at walls where I heard nothing, but where he clearly detected something. The bell issue especially bothered me. I checked his collar multiple times, convinced something was wrong with it. The bell worked perfectly fine, until he decided it shouldn't. I even filmed him once, phone propped on the counter, while he stalked the space behind my washing machine. In the video, you can clearly see his movements, but the bell makes no sound whatsoever. I showed it to my friend Mark, who suggested maybe the collar was getting caught in his fur during hunting mode. But that didn't explain how Milo could run and jump normally with the bell jingling, then suddenly move in complete silence when hunting. About 2 months into this new reality, the dreams started. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, certain I'd heard Milo's bell jingling in my bedroom, only to find him asleep at the foot of my bed, or worse, not in the room at all. One night around 3 a.m, I woke to the distinct sound of his bell. It seemed to be coming from just outside my bedroom door. Half asleep, I called out, "Milo." The jingling stopped immediately. I got up and opened the door, expecting to see him in the hallway. Nothing. The house was completely silent. I checked every room but couldn't find him. Finally, I looked in the laundry room, and there he was, crouched in hunting position, staring at the dryer. No bell sound. The moment he saw me, he relaxed, stretched, and his bell jingled cheerfully as he trotted toward me. "What the hell are you?" I whispered. He just purred and rubbed against my legs. I started reading about cat behavior. Everything I found described them as perfect hunters, evolved predators with specialized killing abilities. One article mentioned that domestic cats retain all their wild instincts despite thousands of years of living alongside humans. They're just smaller versions of their big cat cousins. That thought stuck with me. If Milo could silence a bell through some unexplainable means, move without making a sound, and calculate killing strikes with mathematical precision, what would that look like in a larger predator? The idea kept me up at night. By April, the mouse problem was mostly handled. Milo still caught the occasional rodent, but it was rare. I should have been relieved, but instead I felt increasingly uncomfortable. My perspective had fundamentally shifted. I wasn't living with a pet anymore. I was sharing space with a predator who just happened to like me enough to purr on my lap. I needed a break. I'd always enjoyed camping, though I usually went with friends. This time, I wanted solitude. I packed my gear and drove 50 miles north to a densely wooded area I'd read about but never visited. The forest there was thick, with no designated campgrounds or trails, just pure wilderness. Perfect. I hiked about 4 miles in before setting up my hammock system between two sturdy trees. I had a rainfly, bug net, everything I needed. The first 2 days were exactly what I needed. Peaceful, quiet, with no responsibilities beyond basic survival tasks. I slept better than I had in months. On the third night, I woke suddenly around 2 in the morning. Something felt off. The forest was eerily quiet. No insects chirping, no distant rustling, just silence. I lay perfectly still in my hammock, straining to hear anything. Nothing. Slowly, I unzipped my bug net and peered out. The quarter moon provided just enough light to see the immediate area around my camp. Nothing seemed disturbed. My backpack was still hanging from the tree where I'd left it. No signs of animals getting into my food. I needed to use the bathroom, so I carefully climbed out, grabbing my headlamp. I didn't turn it on immediately, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. That's when I noticed the ground around my hammock. Tracks. Large, unmistakable paw prints circling my sleeping area. My heart nearly stopped. I clicked on my headlamp and crouched down. Mountain lion tracks, fresh enough that the edges were still crisp. The massive cat had walked a complete circle around my hammock, coming within 2 feet of where I'd been sleeping. I followed the tracks with my light. They approached from the north, circled my hammock twice, then headed east. The terrifying realization hit me. This had happened while I slept. A mountain lion, a predator capable of taking down deer, had stalked around me, close enough to strike, and I hadn't heard a thing. It had chosen not to attack. I packed up instantly. I didn't care that it was the middle of the night. Every shadow, every sound as I gathered my gear sent spikes of adrenaline through me. I hiked out by headlamp, probably making enough noise to scare away anything within a mile radius. I didn't stop until I reached my car just after dawn. The drive home was a blur. All I could think about were those tracks circling my hammock, the precision, the silence, the choice. When I got home, Milo greeted me at the door, rubbing against my legs while his bell jingled cheerfully. I scratched behind his ears automatically, but something had changed in how I saw him. That night I was sitting on the couch reading when Milo suddenly perked up, staring at the kitchen doorway. Within seconds, he was in hunting mode. His body lowered, his movements became fluid and silent. The bell went quiet. He stalked across the living room floor without making a sound, exactly like those mountain lion tracks circling my hammock. He disappeared into the kitchen. A moment later, He returned with a mouse, dropped it at my feet like a gift, and looked up at me. His bell jingled normally again as he sat down to clean his paw. I couldn't sleep that night, or the next. I kept thinking about predators and their prey, about the mountain lion that chose not to kill me, about Milo's ability to move in complete silence despite physical limitations. It's been 2 months since the camping trip. I still haven't told anyone the full story. Who would believe that part about the bell anyway? Sometimes I wake up at night thinking I hear jingling, only to find Milo watching me from across the room, perfectly still and silent. Other times, I'll be working at my desk and suddenly feel him staring at me with those calculating green eyes. I don't know what's more unsettling, having slept completely vulnerable while a deadly predator decided my fate, or knowing that the same instinct lives in the animal purring on my lap right now. Story 15. I still remember that day in September 2010 like it happened yesterday, even though it's been years now. I'd been feeling off for months, maybe even years, if I'm honest with myself. Everyone at the salon kept telling me I looked tired, and I brushed it off, saying it was just the long hours standing behind the chair. What else could I say? I was 40, ran 5 miles 3 times a week, ate clean, and hadn't smoked since my 20s. I was supposed to be in my prime, but something wasn't right. I'd get these weird fever flashes in the middle of cutting someone's hair, sweat pouring down my back while my hands would start shaking. The headaches were getting worse too. Not normal headaches, but the kind that make you see spots and have to sit down before you fall down. I kept telling myself it was stress or maybe early menopause. My doctor said my blood work looked mostly normal and suggested I try yoga for the fatigue. Then the auras started, little flashes of light in my peripheral vision. Sometimes they looked like tiny lightning bolts. Other times they were just blurry spots that wouldn't go away no matter how many times I blinked. I'd be in the middle of a cut and color, and suddenly there'd be this bright flash in the corner of my eye. I nearly took off a client's ear once when it happened, started making excuses about the salon lights giving me migraines. That morning in early September, I knew something was seriously wrong the moment I woke up. My partner had to practically drag me out of bed. I couldn't lift my head without the room spinning, and my arms felt like they weighed 100 pounds each. I tried to put on makeup to hide how pale I looked, but my hands were shaking so badly I gave up after poking myself in the eye with the mascara wand. "You're not going to work today," my partner said, but I insisted. I had 6 clients booked, and the salon was already short-staffed because Emily was on maternity leave. I couldn't bail. "Just drive me there. I'll be fine once I get moving," I said. I never made it to the salon. We were about halfway there when everything went dark. 1 second I was fumbling with the radio, trying to find something upbeat to wake me up, and the next second I was slumped against the passenger door with my partner shaking me, screaming my name. I came to for maybe 10 seconds, mumbled something unintelligible, and passed out again. The next thing I remember is the harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency room ceiling rushing past overhead as they wheeled me in. A nurse was taking my pulse, and another one was trying to get an IV in, but kept missing because my veins were collapsing. I could hear them talking, but it sounded like they were underwater. "BP dropping, heart rate 140 and climbing. Get a central line in her now. She's turning gray, we need to move." I felt so cold, bone-deep cold, that no blanket could fix. I remember thinking it was weird that I was so calm about what was happening, like I was watching it happen to someone else. They hooked me up to so many machines, drew what felt like gallons of blood, and kept asking me questions I couldn't answer. Eventually, They moved me to a room upstairs. The ER doctor had said something about my white cell count being off the charts, but I wasn't really processing anything by that point. My partner had stepped out to call my family and my boss at the salon. I was alone in that hospital room, staring at the ceiling when the door opened. He wasn't like the other doctors I'd seen that day. For one thing, he wasn't rushing. He walked in calmly, clipboard in hand, and smiled at me. Really smiled, not that fake reassuring grimace most doctors give you when things are bad. He was average height, maybe 5'9", with salt and pepper hair neatly combed to the side. Mid-40s, I guessed. But what I remember most were his glasses, old-fashioned gold wire-rimmed spectacles that seemed to catch the light in an unusual way. They almost seemed to glow from within. "How are we feeling?" he asked, his voice low and soothing. "Like I'm dying," I said, not knowing how true that might actually be. He nodded thoughtfully. "I'm going to examine you, if that's all right." When he touched my forehead, his hands were ice cold, so cold I flinched. But oddly, it felt good against my burning skin. As he examined me, he asked about my symptoms. Not just the ones from that day, but everything I'd been experiencing for years. The headaches, the fatigue, the visual disturbances. He listened in a way no doctor had ever listened to me before. "You should have come in sooner," he said, but there was no judgment in his voice. After the examination, he made some notes on his clipboard. I asked him what was wrong with me, and he looked at me over those strange golden glasses. "We'll need to run more tests, but I suspect your body is fighting a significant battle." He placed his cold hand over mine and squeezed gently. "Don't worry, everything will be okay." The strangest thing happened when he said that. I believed him completely. Despite lying in a hospital bed, despite feeling worse than I'd ever felt in my life, a profound sense of peace washed over me. He nodded once more and left the room. My partner returned shortly after, followed by an oncologist and 2 residents. That's when I heard the words that should have destroyed me. Stage 4 B-cell lymphoma. It had spread throughout my lymphatic system and was making its way into my bone marrow. The oncologist, Dr. Patel, was shocked I'd been functioning at all. According to him, I should have been bedridden for months with how advanced it was. "The 5-year survival rate for cases like yours is about 2%, he said, trying to sound clinical, but I could see the pity in his eyes. "We need to start aggressive chemotherapy immediately." The next few weeks were a blur of chemo, nausea, more tests, and watching my hair, my pride and joy as a stylist, fall out in clumps. 3 rounds of chemo and the cancer wasn't responding. If anything, it was getting more aggressive. I could see it in Dr. Patel's face every time he came in to review my charts. He was losing hope. They decided to try a new protocol, an experimental treatment that carried significant risks, the main one being permanent nerve damage. Dr. Patel was brutally honest with me. "You'll likely lose feeling in your extremities. Your fine motor skills will be compromised. I have to tell you that returning to work as a hairstylist, it's probably not going to be possible." My partner broke down crying, but I just felt numb. I'd already accepted that I was going to die. The 2% survival statistic kept echoing in my head. I'd made my peace with it. If I had maybe a month left, did it really matter if I couldn't cut hair anymore? "Do it," I said. The new treatment was even worse than the regular chemo. It felt like acid running through my veins. My fingertips turned blue, then gray. I couldn't feel them at all after the 2nd day. The doctors were concerned, but pressed on. What choice did they have? Let the cancer kill me instead of the treatment? A week into the new protocol, something impossible happened. The tumors started shrinking, not gradually but rapidly. Dr. Patel ordered new scans because he couldn't believe the blood tests. When the results came back, the entire oncology team was baffled. The cancer wasn't just in remission. In many areas, it appeared to be completely gone. "I've never seen anything like this," Dr. Patel admitted, studying my chart with a perplexed expression. "It's like your body suddenly decided to fight back with everything it had." I was scheduled to be transferred to a specialized hospital for a bone marrow transplant as a precaution. The night before the transfer, I asked the head nurse if I could speak to the doctor with the gold glasses, the one who had examined me that first day and told me everything would be okay. I wanted to thank him for giving me hope when I needed it most. The nurse, who had been checking my IV, froze. "Which doctor?" I described him in detail: his height, his age, those distinctive gold-rimmed glasses, his unnaturally cold hands. She shook her head slowly. "Honey, we don't have a doctor like that on staff. Never have, at least not in the 15 years I've been here." But he examined me. He had a clipboard. He knew about all my symptoms. The nurse patted my hand. "You've been through a lot. The medications can cause vivid hallucinations sometimes. But I know what I saw, what I felt. That wasn't a hallucination. His cold touch, those glowing glasses, that absolute certainty when he told me everything would be okay, right before I received a diagnosis that should have been a death sentence. Against all odds, the bone marrow transplant was successful. The cancer never came back. Even more miraculously, I regained feeling in my fingers within 6 months. Within a year, I was back behind the chair at the salon, doing what I love. The doctors had no explanation. Dr. Patel called it medically impossible, and wrote a paper about my case for some journal. I never saw the doctor with the gold glasses again, though I looked for him every time I went back for checkups. I've tried to find records of him working at the hospital, even briefly, but there's nothing. No one remembers him except me. Some might call it a hallucination or a dream. Others might say it was my guardian angel or some kind of spirit guide. All I know is that when I was at my lowest point, someone, or something, came to me and promised everything would be okay. And against every medical prediction, it was. Sometimes when I'm cutting hair under the bright salon lights, I catch a flash of gold in my peripheral vision, just for a second. And I know he's still watching over me. Story 16. I've been hesitant to share this story for years. Most people outside our province would think I'm crazy or making things up for attention. But I swear on my life and on the graves of my ancestors that what I'm about to tell you happened exactly as I remember it. This happened about 7 years ago, when I was 24. I'd moved back to my hometown in Caramoan after finishing college in Manila. The transition from city life back to our small coastal community was tough at first, but I missed the sea. Growing up, my grandfather, we call our grandfathers Lolo in Filipino, taught me everything about fishing. It was in my blood. My childhood friend Anton and I would often go night fishing. The catch is better then, and there's something peaceful about being on the water under the stars. That night started like any other. We planned to stay out until early morning when the tuna are most active. We took my uncle's small banca, a wooden outrigger boat, and packed our usual gear: lines, bait, a small cooler with some San Miguel beers, and sandwiches my mother insisted on making. I also brought the kerosene lamp that had belonged to my Lolo. It was old but reliable, casting a warm yellow glow that was just enough to see what we were doing without scaring away the fish. We pushed off from shore around 10 in the evening. The night was unusually still. I remember commenting to Anton how the water looked like glass, no waves, just a perfect reflection of the half-moon above. In hindsight, that should have been our first warning. The sea is never that calm in our region. "Pare, it's too quiet," Anton said as we paddled out to our usual spot about a kilometer from shore. "Maybe the fish gods are finally giving us a break," I joked, trying to lighten the mood. But I felt it too. Something was different about that night. We reached our spot around 11 and cut the small motor, letting the banka drift gently while we set up our lines. The stillness was almost oppressive. No wind, no waves, not even the distant sounds of other fishermen that usually dotted the waters, just silence. For the first hour, we didn't catch anything, which was unusual. This spot had never failed us before. We drank our beers and talked about village gossip, trying to ignore the growing unease. Anton was telling me about his cousin's wedding plans when he suddenly stopped mid-sentence. "Do you smell that?" he asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. I sniffed the air. There was a strange, pungent odor, like burning herbs mixed with something rotten. It wasn't the normal smell of the sea or fish. This was something else entirely. "Probably just smoke from the village," I said, but even as I spoke the words, I knew that wasn't it. The smell was too strong, too immediate, as if its source was right there with us. That's when the temperature dropped. It wasn't gradual. One moment we were sweating in the humid night air. The next, I could see my breath forming clouds in front of my face. My skin prickled with goosebumps, and the hair on my arms stood up. "What the fuck?" Anton whispered, clutching his arms around himself. "Is this normal?" Before I could answer, the kerosene lamp flickered violently, nearly going out before burning twice as bright as before. The sudden flare illuminated the water around our boat, and what I saw made my stomach drop. The fish, hundreds of them, were floating dead on the surface. Small silvery bodies surrounding our boat in a perfect circle, as if marking a boundary. "We need to go," Anton said, already reaching for the motor. "Something's wrong." I nodded, pulling in my line with shaking hands. That's when we heard it, a sound like fabric flapping in the wind coming from somewhere above us. Slowly, reluctantly, we both looked up. Hovering about 15 feet above our boat was what appeared to be a man, not floating, not swimming, hovering in midair. In the dim light, I could make out a thin, elongated figure wearing dark clothes that seemed to move independently of any wind. His face was partly obscured, but what I could see wasn't right. The proportions were off, the features too sharp and angular to be fully human. Anton let out a choked sound somewhere between a gasp and a whimper. The motor forgotten, he collapsed onto the floor of the boat, making the sign of the cross repeatedly. The figure began to move, slowly circling above our boat. With each pass, it dipped lower, 10 feet above us, then 8, then 6. "It's a mankukulam," I whispered, using the local term for witch. My grandfather had told me stories about them since I was a child, humans who practiced dark magic, who could transform and fly at night, who fed on fear and could curse entire families for generations. As if hearing my thoughts, the hovering figure suddenly changed direction. It stopped circling and faced us directly. Even in the dim light, I could now see its eyes, completely black, with no whites visible. Its mouth was stretched into an unnatural grin that revealed teeth filed to points. Then it dove at us. The attack was swift and deliberate. The witch dropped from the sky like a stone, pulling up at the last moment to skim just above our heads. The banka rocked violently, nearly capsizing as water splashed over the sides. Anton was sobbing now, curled into a ball at the bottom of the boat, praying incoherently. The witch ascended again, preparing for another dive. I knew if it continued, we wouldn't survive another attack or two. Our small boat was already taking on water, and we were too far from shore to swim, especially with whatever this thing was hunting us. As the witch hovered, preparing for another assault, something clicked in my brain. A memory of my Lolo sitting by the fire, telling me how he once faced a mancuculum near these very waters. They gain power from your fear, he had told me. Show none, and you take away their strength. But more importantly, they hide among us. They're not spirits or demons. They're people from your own village. In that moment of clarity, I made a decision that probably saved our lives. As the witch began its second dive, I stood up in the rocking boat. Anton grabbed at my legs, begging me to get down, but I shook him off. I planted my feet as firmly as possible and stared directly at the approaching figure. "I know who you are," I shouted, my voice steady despite the terror coursing through me. "If you don't leave now, I'll burn your house down tomorrow." The effect was immediate. The witch pulled up sharply, hanging in the air just meters away. The black eyes narrowed, studying me with what looked like surprise or confusion. "I know exactly who you are," I continued, the lie giving me courage. "My Lolo told me about you before he died. He knew your family. He knew your secret." For what felt like an eternity, we stared at each other. Me standing in a battered fishing boat, the witch floating impossibly above the glassy water. I could hear Anton's ragged breathing below me, the gentle lap of water against wood, and nothing else. Then, slowly, the witch's unnatural grin faded, its head tilted, reminding me of a curious bird. Without warning, it backed away, moving horizontally across the water without breaking eye contact. The farther it got, the less human it looked, its form seeming to elongate and distort until it was just a dark smudge against the night sky. And then it was gone. I collapsed back into the boat, my legs finally giving out. Anton was still crying, but more quietly now. Neither of us spoke as we bailed water from the banka and started the motor with trembling hands. The journey back to shore was the longest 20 minutes of my life. Every shadow, every ripple in the water made my heart race. The dead fish were gone when we left that spot, as if they'd never existed. Even the strange smell had vanished. The only evidence something had happened was the water in our boat and our shared terror. We reached the shore just as dawn was breaking. Anton immediately ran to his house without saying goodbye. I don't blame him. I wanted nothing more than to lock myself in my room and pretend it had been a nightmare, but I knew it wasn't. Later that day, after a few hours of fitful sleep, I went to visit my uncle, my Lolo's brother, and told him what happened. I expected him to laugh it off or tell me I'd been drinking too much. Instead, he went very quiet, then asked me exactly where we'd been fishing. When I told him, he nodded as if confirming something. "Your Lolo confronted a mancuculum there 30 years ago," he said. "Same spot, same method. He threatened to expose the witch's identity to the village. It worked then, too." "But who is it?" I asked. "If it's someone from our village, don't we have the right to know?" My uncle shook his head. "Your Lolo never told anyone who he suspected. He said knowing put you in more danger than not knowing. The important thing is that you remembered his lessons. You stood your ground instead of showing fear." Anton and I never went night fishing again. He moved to Cebu City 6 months later and rarely comes back to visit. When he does, we don't talk about what happened. As for me, I still fish these waters, but always return before sunset. Sometimes, when I'm on the sea and the water is especially still, I catch myself looking up, scanning the empty sky above me. And sometimes, though I tell myself it's just birds or clouds, I see a dark shape moving against the horizon, watching and waiting. To this day, I don't know if it was truly a witch or something else entirely. I don't know if my bluff really worked or if it just wasn't my time to die. But I do know that the stories my Lolo told me, stories I once dismissed as old superstitions, saved my life that night. The sea holds many secrets. Some of them should stay beneath the surface. Story 17. I've always been drawn to the isolation of nature. There's something about being completely alone in the wilderness that resets my soul. That's what I was looking for when I headed out to that remote cabin in British Columbia 3 weeks ago. God, it feels like 3 years now. I've been a wildlife photographer for almost 15 years. Started with local wildlife refuges near Seattle, then national parks, and gradually moved to more remote locations. My specialty became capturing animals that most people never see, the elusive predators and shy forest dwellers that avoid human contact. I've spent weeks alone in the wilderness before. I know how to handle myself. At least, I thought I did. The cabin was about as remote as you can get these days. A small, sturdy log structure that belonged to the Canadian Park Service, used occasionally by researchers and rangers. I had to hike 2 full days to reach it after parking my truck at the ranger station. No cell service, no internet, just me and my equipment. Perfect for what I needed. When I arrived, I was exhausted but excited. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by massive old-growth pines. It wasn't much, just a main room with a wood stove, a small bedroom area, and basic amenities. But it had a covered porch where I could sit and watch the forest, and that's all I cared about. The first couple of days went exactly as planned. I set up my gear, placed wildlife cameras at strategic points around the clearing and along nearby game trails, and settled into my routine. Wake at dawn, check cameras, spend the day hiking and shooting, then return to review footage and make journal entries. I remember writing in my log that first night, perfect silence except for the wind and occasional bird calls. This is exactly what I needed. By the third day, though, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. The forest was quiet, too quiet. Anyone who spends time in the wilderness knows it's never actually silent. There's always something rustling, calling, moving. But here, it was like everything was holding its breath. I noticed that animals seemed to stay at the very edges of the clearing, just at the tree line, rarely venturing into open space. Even the birds would go silent for long stretches. I told myself it was just the unfamiliar territory, making me hyper-aware of patterns that probably existed everywhere. On the 5th night, I woke up around midnight feeling uneasy. Just that inexplicable sense that something wasn't right. I got up, grabbed my flashlight, and checked around the cabin. Nothing seemed out of place, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I remember standing on the porch, sweeping my light across the tree line, and seeing nothing but darkness. I told myself I was being ridiculous and went back to bed. The next morning, day 6, I found the first disturbance. Just outside the cabin door was a patch of overturned dirt, like something had been digging. Not unusual in itself, could be any forest animal, but it was right next to the steps where animals typically wouldn't approach. About 20 feet away, near the edge of the clearing, I found a small pile of stones stacked on top of each other, 3 stones placed deliberately, I'm not superstitious, but that made my skin crawl. I kicked it over and went about my day, though I stayed closer to the cabin than I'd planned. That night I checked my camera footage and saw something strange. On 2 of the cameras, there were periods where the motion sensors triggered, but the footage just showed indistinct shapes at the edge of the frame, too blurry to identify, sometimes wide, sometimes thin, but clearly something moving just out of clear view. I wrote in my log, possible bear or moose activity near cameras 3 and 5. Will reposition tomorrow for better angles. That night, I slept poorly. The wind had picked up, and branches kept scraping against the cabin roof. At least, I told myself it was branches. Around 3 in the morning, I jerked awake, certain I'd heard something moving on the porch. I grabbed my flashlight and my bear spray and went to check, but there was nothing there, just the wind and that persistent feeling of being watched. On day 7, I found fresh claw marks on 3 trees surrounding the clearing. They were about 7 feet up the trunk, which could indicate a bear, but something about them didn't look right. They were too methodical, too evenly spaced, and they all faced the cabin. I spent that day repositioning cameras and checking the perimeter of the clearing. I found more of those stone piles, 5 of them now, arranged in what seemed like a rough semicircle around the cabin. I knocked them all down and made sure my cameras had clear views of those spots. That night was when it really started. I woke up at exactly 3:12 a.m. I remember checking my watch, to what sounded like soft tapping on the bedroom window. Tap, tap, tap. Perfectly rhythmic. My first thought was branch in the wind, but there was no wind that night. The forest was dead still. I grabbed my flashlight and crept to the window. The tapping stopped as I approached. I shined my light outside and saw nothing, but as I was about to turn away, I caught movement at the tree line. A dark figure, standing perfectly motionless, just inside the edge of the forest. I couldn't make out details, just a tall, dark shape that seemed to be watching the cabin. I stood frozen, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure didn't move, it just stood there. After what felt like forever, I moved away from the window and grabbed my satellite phone to call the ranger station. But before I could dial, I heard the tapping again. This time from a different window, on the opposite side of the cabin. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. I sat in the main room with my bear spray and knife, watching the windows and listening to occasional tapping that seemed to move around the cabin's perimeter. At dawn, I went outside, expecting to find tracks or some evidence of whatever had been there. Nothing. The ground was undisturbed except for my own footprints. The stone piles were back, though, rebuilt exactly where they had been before. I spent that morning reviewing camera footage. Most showed nothing unusual, but one camera, the one pointing at the spot where I'd seen the figure, captured something that made my blood run cold. At 3:17 a.m., a tall entity with unnaturally high shoulders and elongated arms came to the edge of the clearing. It stood absolutely still, watching the cabin for nearly 20 minutes before retreating into the forest. The footage wasn't clear. It was night vision, and the figure stayed partially obscured by trees. But it was definitely not a bear or any animal I recognized. I should have left then. I should have packed up and hiked out. Cameras be damned. But I told myself there had to be a rational explanation. Maybe it was another photographer or hiker playing a prank. Maybe it was some kind of rare animal behavior I didn't understand. I decided to stay one more night with all my cameras focused on the tree line. That was my mistake. The disturbances escalated that day. I found all my stone piles kicked over, despite having not touched them myself. Something had moved my backpack from the porch to the middle of the clearing. and the tapping started before sunset, soft but insistent on different parts of the cabin. I wrote in my log, "Something is definitely out there, not behaving like any wildlife I've encountered, considering leaving tomorrow if this continues." That night, the tapping was constant. It would start on one wall, then immediately switch to another, as if whatever was causing it could move instantly around the cabin. At one point, it sounded like something was on the roof, moving with heavy, deliberate steps. I tried to stay calm, to think logically. I checked the cameras remotely from my laptop, but they showed nothing approaching the cabin. Whatever this was, it could somehow approach without triggering the motion sensors or showing up on camera. Around midnight, the tapping stopped. The sudden silence was almost worse. I sat in the dark, listening to my own breathing, waiting. Then something slid under the door. A small piece of paper that hadn't been there before. On it was a crude drawing of the cabin with a figure inside, presumably me, and several tall figures surrounding it outside. I'm not ashamed to admit I panicked then. I grabbed my emergency pack, my satellite phone, and my knife, and decided to hell with waiting until morning. I was getting out now. But when I opened the door, I saw them. 3 or 4 tall figures standing in a semicircle around the cabin, just at the edge of the light spilling from the doorway. They were unnaturally still, with limbs that seemed too long for their bodies. I couldn't make out faces, just dark shapes where heads should be. I slammed the door shut and barricaded it, then did the same with the windows. The tapping started again, more insistent now, from all directions at once. I tried the satellite phone, but it wouldn't connect, just static and a strange rhythmic clicking that matched the tapping on the walls. I don't know how long this went on. Hours, maybe. I was beyond exhausted, beyond terrified. At some point, I must have dozed off despite everything because I jerked awake to complete silence. Dawn light was filtering through the window. The tapping had stopped. I waited nearly an hour before cautiously approaching a window and looking out. The clearing was empty, no figures, no disturbances. Just the morning mist rising from the ground and birds singing as if nothing had happened. I checked the cameras. Nothing. No footage of the figures, no evidence of anything approaching the cabin, just empty forest. I'm writing this now from the cabin. It's my last day here. I've packed everything and I'm leaving as soon as I finish this entry. Something is watching me even now, I can feel it. It's been watching all day, from just out of sight. The strangest thing, I've started to feel like it's waiting for me to join it, like it's been inviting me all along. Last night, in those moments before dawn when I dozed off, I dreamed I was walking into the forest, following tall figures that moved between the trees like they belonged there. They were showing me something deeper in the woods, something important. When I woke up, I was standing on the porch. I don't remember getting up. I'm leaving now. I don't know what's out there, but I'm not staying to find out. If anyone reads this. Story 18. I never used to be afraid of the woods. Actually, I grew up loving them. My family had a cabin in upstate New York where we'd spend most summers, and I've been camping since I was old enough to carry my own backpack. But something happened last June that changed everything for me. I still go camping, but I'm different now, more watchful, more afraid, and I absolutely refuse to sleep when there are raccoons nearby. It started as just another weekend trip. Me and 3 friends, Ryan, Jake, and Chris, decided to hike deep into the Adirondacks. We're all experienced outdoorsmen, and we wanted something more remote than the designated campgrounds with their picnic tables and fire pits. We hiked about 7 miles off the main trail, following a creek that eventually opened up into a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. "This is perfect," Ryan said when we found the spot around 3 in the afternoon. It really was. Flat ground, natural windbreak from the trees, and the creek nearby for water. We set up our tents in a rough circle, gathered firewood, and spent the rest of the daylight hours fishing and exploring the surrounding area. As the sun started to set, we got a good fire going and cooked the 2 trout Chris had managed to catch. We added some freeze-dried meals to round out dinner, passing around a flask of bourbon while exchanging the usual bullshit stories guys tell when they're out in the woods. By midnight, everyone had turned in except me. I've always been a bit of a night owl, and there's something about sitting alone by a campfire that I find peaceful. The flames had died down to embers, casting just enough light to see the immediate area around our camp. The moon was nearly full, filtering through the tree canopy in silver patches. I was just about to head to my tent when I heard it, a rustling sound from the edge of our clearing. Now, hearing animals at night isn't unusual. The woods are full of creatures that come alive after dark. But this sound was different. It wasn't the random movement of an animal foraging. It was deliberate, methodical, like something moving with purpose. I grabbed my flashlight but decided against turning it on immediately. Sometimes your eyes adjust better to the darkness without artificial light. I stared toward the sound, which seemed to be coming from a dense patch of undergrowth about 20 yards from our campsite. That's when I saw them, eyes reflecting the dim glow of our dying fire. 2 small orbs close to the ground, gleaming with an eerie yellowish-green light. Raccoon, I thought. Just a raccoon looking for scraps. I relaxed a bit. We'd hung our food bag from a tree branch away from camp, following proper procedure. The raccoon would find nothing and move on. But then I saw more eyes. Not just 1 pair, but 3, 4, 5 pairs of eyes, all at the same height, all moving in unison toward our camp. They moved with a synchronized precision that sent a chill down my spine. I flicked on my flashlight, pointing it toward the eyes. They didn't scatter as I expected. Instead, they paused, the light reflecting off their masked faces. 5 raccoons stood at the edge of our clearing, completely still, staring directly at me. At the center was the largest raccoon I've ever seen, easily twice the size of a normal adult, with a distinctive gray patch on its chest. The big one, the leader, I realized later, made a strange clicking sound with its mouth. Immediately, the raccoons split into 2 groups, moving with what I can only describe as tactical precision. 3 headed toward our supply packs, which we'd left under a tarp near the fire. The other 2, including the leader, circled around toward the tents. I stood up, waving my arms. "Hey, get out of here!" I shouted, expecting them to scatter like normal wildlife. They didn't. The leader turned its head toward me, and I swear to God, it smiled. Not the anthropomorphic smile you see in cartoons, but a knowing expression that had no business being on an animal's face. It made a guttural sound, not a normal raccoon chatter, and the others paused, looking toward it. The leader made another clicking noise, and the raccoons resumed their movement, but with a subtle change in direction. They were now giving me a wider berth while still approaching our supplies. I reached down and grabbed a half-burned stick from the fire, waving it toward them. "Go away!" I yelled, loud enough that I thought I'd wake my friends. No one stirred in the tents. The raccoons paused again, but they didn't retreat. The leader made another sound, a series of soft grunts. and they continued their approach, undeterred by my burning stick. I stood there, frozen in disbelief, as they methodically began examining our equipment. They weren't just rummaging randomly like animals searching for food. They were investigating, examining, assessing. One raccoon unzipped Ryan's backpack with its dexterous paws and began removing items one by one, studying each before either setting it aside or nudging it toward another raccoon. The leader moved to our camping supplies and began what I can only describe as an inventory. It would pick up an item, a multi-tool, a compass, a lighter, examine it carefully, and then either replace it or set it in a growing pile of objects. I noticed one raccoon had discovered my own backpack. It was meticulously removing the contents, examining each item before making what seemed like a decision about its value. I watched in horrified fascination as it rejected my clothes and toiletries, but carefully set aside my Swiss Army knife, compass, and the small flashlight I kept in an outer pocket. "Guys," I finally called toward the tents. "Wake up, you need to see this." No response. The fire had died down to almost nothing now, and the clearing was mostly lit by moonlight. I considered walking over to shake my friends awake, but that would mean getting closer to the raccoons, which were now completely focused on their systematic plundering of our supplies. What happened next still haunts me. The leader, after collecting several small items, looked directly at me again. It tilted its head, those intelligent eyes fixed on mine, and made a deliberate nodding motion, once, twice, before turning to the others and making a sharp barking sound. Immediately, the raccoons began gathering their selected items. Not randomly, not in a frenzy, but methodically. Some objects they carried in their mouths, others they pushed along the ground in organized piles. The smaller ones worked together to move larger items, one pushing while another pulled. I stood there, flashlight in one hand, burning stick in the other, unable to process what I was seeing. These weren't animals behaving on instinct. This was a coordinated operation. The leader made one final sound, a long, low whistle that didn't sound remotely like any noise a raccoon should be able to make, and the group retreated into the darkness, taking their selected items with them. I remained frozen for several minutes after they disappeared, straining my eyes against the darkness, trying to comprehend what I'd just witnessed. Finally, I shook myself out of my stupor and hurried to check what they'd taken. My headlamp was gone. So was Jake's multi-tool, Chris's fire starter, several energy bars, a roll of duct tape, a small first aid kit, my backup battery pack, and oddly, 3 pairs of socks, one from each of my friends' packs. They'd also taken Ryan's map and compass. I spent the rest of the night keeping watch, stoking the fire back to a bright blaze and jumping at every sound from the forest. I was afraid they'd come back, perhaps with more of them. When dawn finally broke, I was exhausted, but still wired with adrenaline. As my friends began to stir, I immediately launched into an explanation of what had happened. "Dude, you're losing it," Jake laughed after I finished my story. "Raccoons don't work together like that. Then how do you explain this?" I pointed to our strewn supplies and missing equipment. "You probably fell asleep and a couple of raccoons rummaged through our stuff," Chris suggested. "The rest is just your dream." "I wasn't sleeping," I insisted. "They were organized. They communicated with each other. They selected specific items to take." Ryan knelt down, examining the paw prints around our supplies. "There were definitely raccoons here," he admitted. "Probably a family group. But Marcus, they're just animals. They grab shiny things, things with food smells. They're opportunistic, not tactical." I couldn't make them understand. How could I explain the way the leader had looked at me? The deliberate head movements, the calculated retreat, the way they'd work together to move larger objects. We spent an extra hour reorganizing our supplies and securing what remained. The missing map meant we had to navigate by memory on our way back, which added stress to an already tense situation. My friends remained skeptical, treating me with the kind of cautious concern you show someone you think might be having a mental breakdown. But I know what I saw. Since that night, I've researched raccoon behavior extensively. I've read scientific papers, watched nature documentaries, consulted with wildlife experts. Nothing explains what I witnessed. Raccoons are intelligent, yes. They have dexterous paws and problem-solving abilities, but coordinated group tactics, systematic selection of useful human tools, deliberate communication with head movements, none of that is normal. I've been camping twice since then, both times in different forests. Both times I've noticed raccoons watching from the tree line, just watching, waiting. Sometimes I think I spot one with a gray chest patch, but it's always too far away to be certain. Last week, I was hiking alone on a day trip near my home when I found something that made my blood run cold. Hanging from a low branch, carefully arranged, were 3 pairs of socks, exactly like the ones taken from our campsite months earlier. They were positioned in a way no animal could have managed by accident, in a location far from any trail or campsite. I left them untouched and hiked out immediately. I don't tell this story expecting people to believe me. My own friends don't believe me, and they were there. But I know what I saw, and I know something unnatural is happening in those woods. Something organized, something intelligent. Now when I camp, I keep everything locked in hard-sided containers. I never sleep when others are awake, and I always keep a fire burning through the night, because I know they're out there, watching, communicating, planning. And I can't shake the memory of those knowing eyes, or that almost human nod, or the feeling that they weren't just taking our supplies, they were studying us,